afternoon session. So I'm Gian-Marco Rignanese, and I'll be chairing the session, which is about machine learning. So we have 15 minutes introduction, in which I will give about the topics that will be covered in this session. So as we have seen in the previous talks, there's a number of computed materials database properties that have become available online. So we've already seen a few talks about Flow or QMD, Nomad, the Materials Cloud. We haven't seen the Materials project yet, but there's going to be a talk related to that this afternoon. And then one has to realize that when you have to compute materials property, the time that it takes, sorry, the video didn't change compared to my screen. So the time that it takes to compute different properties can be quite different. When you compute the structure, properties related to chemistry or to the electronic structure, that's rather small compared to the time that is needed to, say, compute the elastic properties of a system or the piezoelectric properties of a system. And so it's not surprising that when you look into the databases that I was mentioning before, most of the information that has been computed is related precisely to those properties that are easy to compute, because it takes a huge amount of CPU hours to compute properties anyway. And so those that are more complicated have a limited amount of data. And so this is where machine learning can really become important, because it can help for those properties that have not been computed in a large amount to train the machine learning model, and that gets some idea of an idea of the range that the property can get for some materials, and then maybe do an actual calculation that is long, but you can afford it when it's for a limited number of materials. And so we have seen that material science is actually witnessing a shift to the so-called fourth paradigm. So we had the first three, which are empirical science, theoretical science, and computational science, and now we're moving to this big, and the big is between parentheses, because we know that indeed there are cases in which there is a limited amount of data, so big data-driven science. And so this can be seen if you look at the number of publications that is growing almost exponentially. So you can see that now. And so what we are going to have here this afternoon is discussing about that. And so what is nice about the fact that the field is growing is that you can find plenty of review articles. If you're new to the field, you can go through, just search a review about machine learning in material science, and we'll find really plenty of those. There is a huge number of those. Okay, so in all the cases, what machine learning will be used for is this idea of going from the processing condition that I use to synthesize a material, then the structure that this materials get, then move from the structures to the properties, and finally get the performance of the material. So the first step, this relationship is a relationship of cause and effect. The process induces a given structure, the structure induces the properties, and the properties induce the performance. And so the materials informatics can generate such forward model that can allow you to predict, for instance, the property as a function of the processing condition, the composition, and the structure. That's an example. But what we are interested in also is to go the other way around. Is, let's say that I want to achieve a given performance. What is the processing? What are the structure that I want to get? What are the properties that I need to have in order to achieve that performance? So that's this inverse relation, which is called the inverse design, because we want, for instance, to maximize a property such that it meets my requirement for the application that I have in mind. In all the cases, when you do these kind of things, the first part is to featureize the data. And so that's really a crucial point. So for instance, if I take the example of going from the structure to the property, I want to convert my crystal or my molecule into a bunch of numbers that describe the structure. This is a vector of number that basically describe this the structure. And so this afternoon, we're going to have a number of different such featureization process that will be used. So in the talk of Elias Vlieg, I saw that he was using a DeepChem, which is a repository where different ways to transform a molecule into a number of descriptors are used. We're going to have a talk by Anubhav, Jain, in which he will use Matbench, which is also another repository that generates a bunch of features based on the crystal structure. We're going to see that in the talk of Yousung Jun, so the first speaker, that he uses invertible image-based featurization because it is clear that the field of machine learning developed quite a lot in the field of images. And so there's a lot of featurization that has already been achieved and studied different methods as far as images are concerned. In the talks of yesterday, we've heard about SOAP, ACE, and there are many more that I'm not able to cite now. So in this afternoon session, so we'll first have several talks that will deal with this forward relationship that goes from the cause to the effect. And with the first talk by, it's actually not the first talk of this afternoon because of the time schedule. So the first talk by Elias Vlieg is going to be about he's coming from the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And so he's going to speak about how artificial networks can be used to make predictions about co-crystals. So the idea is that you have two molecules and you see whether or not they can form a co-crystal together. So we'll learn about much more about that in his talk. Then there's going to be a talk by Assaf Anderson from Tel Aviv, Israel. So he's from a private company, Material Zone. And because it's a private company, actually, I was not able to find exactly the kind of methods that they are using. So I'm not able to, to identify which of the methods they are using. And so I guess that we'll learn much more from that from Assaf. Then in the talk of Anubhav, he's going to be presenting something about benchmarking the different models that have been defined, because there are different models that are available from machine learning, and they have developed a workbench where you can test the new methods that you develop and see how they perform compared to previous methods. And then finally, the last talk is going to be about the inverse design thing. So that's, developing a material that is such that it will have a targeted performance. So that's the performance that guides the whole chain of processing structures and properties. So that's something that is called inverse design, and that will be covered in the talk of Yousung Jun from the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. And so it will show us how they handle that. Among other things, what they have to define is to have something that is called an autoencoder, and that allows to define a latent space. And just to give you an example of what can be done with that, maybe some of you have seen that, again, coming to images, which is the field in which the machine learning has developed quite a lot. So what they've been able to do there is to define the latent space that allows them to identify, in the case of faces, to identify the region where the pictures look like much more to a woman, than to a man. And as a result, you can take one existing picture and push it in the direction of making it more women-like or more men-like. And so this is something that if we could do something like that with materials, we would be able to define, say, for instance, a direction in which a material becomes more conducting or less conducting, material becomes more transparent, less transparent, stuff like that. So this is really something that we should try to aim at. I know that is something difficult, but I hope that we will hear about that in the talk by Yousung Jun. And so with that, I have finished my presentation, and as usual, I was quite fast in doing that. So I don't know if there are questions about my introduction. Otherwise, we can start a bit earlier with the first talk. I don't know if Yousung is here already. Yeah, yes. Yeah. So I'm just going to present the order of the presentation, and then the word will be yours, Yousung. So the first talk indeed is going to be by Yousung Jun. Then the second one is going to be by Elias Vlieg, who is here in Louvain. Then we will hear Assaf Anderson, who is in Tel Aviv. And finally, after the coffee break, we'll hear Anubhav Jain, who is in California and most probably still sleeping a bit at the moment. So Yousung, the floor is yours. You can share your screen and then start your presentation. We're a bit ahead of schedule, but I think that's fine.
Okay, thank you very much, Gian-Marco, for a very kind introduction. And also, thank you very much for introducing our paper on the image-based representation of the solid-state structures. Incidentally, I I designed my talk such that I will not just focus on image-based representation and its application to generative model, but also general overview of research along the use of machine learning for maturity research that's going in my group.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
If that's okay.
Yeah,
Thank you. So yeah, so thank you very much again. It's a great pleasure for me to.
Maybe you can put your screen in full screen mode because we see the slide on the side.
Okay, yes, I can do that. So let me see.
It's probably the arrow there, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, so it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this FAIR-DI workshop, and as we all know, in materials informatics, basically, what we want to do is to understand the structure property relationships of the materials based on the data, and then we really want to predict the property of the materials given the structure, and that's the forward prediction, and also as Gian-Marco mentioned. You can also go the other way around. In other words, we define the property first, and then property that you want to achieve, and I try to come up with a structure that would have such a property, and that would be the open inverse design. And so by doing this kind of mapping forward or inverse, you basically want to dramatically reduce the time and cost for the novel discovery. There are several ingredients that are needed to do the materials informatics. By the way, do you see the old title, or do you
it's
see
perfect.
this?
We see everything.
Okay, great. So there are several key ingredients to do materials informatics, and of course, this is data-driven approach. You need the data, and you need the representation for the materials. And once you have the data and representation, then you can perform a simple regression to make a model that would allow us to do the property predictions. And once you have such a tool to make a property prediction, the next important task, perhaps much more challenging task, is to explore the chemical space to pinpoint the material or molecule that would have such a target property. And this is very difficult because the chemical space is essentially almost infinite in practice. And so it's almost like finding a needle in a haystack. And the third aspect is that we more or less all know that many of those materials that are computationally designed, if not most, are discarded in the laboratory because they are not synthesized. And so it'd be good to have a model that would allow us to predict the synthesizability of those materials ahead of the experiments. So today I'm going to talk about some of the works that have been going on in my group along the lines of these three different subjects. So there'll be a short intro of my talk, and I'll start with the property prediction. And so, like I said, once you have the data and representation, then you can perform simple regressions and make a property prediction model. And so far, these kind of prediction models are mainly based on feature engineering. In other words, you basically come up with features that would represent the physics of the property that you are interested in. And for example, for catalysis applications, where you, for example, want to predict the binding energy of CO on top of various metal surfaces, and you can use some kind of mean field descriptors like electronegativity or even the width, and then it can sort of predict the binding energy using these kinds of mean field descriptors. But these kinds of feature-derived descriptors are promising, but they could be cumbersome because if you want to predict a different property, then you need to come up with a different set of descriptors. And also, these kinds of features are heavily dependent on the expert knowledge that could differ from person to person. And so it'd be good to have descriptors that could be generally applicable regardless of different properties. And so to do that, people are trying to use a structural encoding. And this is similar to situations in electronic structure calculations where you basically use Hamiltonian of the system no matter what property that you are calculating. And so because regardless of properties, you basically use the coordinates of atoms and identities of atoms, and that's all. And so you can sort of expect similar things in machine learning if you do some kind of structural encoding. And there are a number of different ways of encoding the structures of the molecules and crystals. And one of the more promising approaches is to represent the molecules and materials using graphs. In graphs, representation is basically represent the atoms as nodes and chemical bonds as edges. And by sort of a mathematical operation called convolutions, you can incorporate the information of the remote atoms locally. And by performing several such convolutions, you can basically encode the information of the entire molecule. And these graph methods have been shown to yield promising performance for different properties for molecules and crystals. And for catalysis application, again, Elias group showed that they obtained about 0.13 electron volt better for the prediction of CO and H binding energies on different metal surfaces. So it was good, except that in order to use graph, when you make a prediction, you basically need the structure of the material. And so in practice, in order to use this kind of graph model, you basically need to perform DFT geometry relaxations ahead of time. And of course, if you have already done the DFT relaxations, there's no need to use a machine learning model. So the motivation of us working on this field was that it'd be good to have a model that could predict the binding energies without geometry relaxations. And so to do that, to that end, we basically removed adsorbates on top of the surfaces and label the active site atoms in a pseudoatom, in a fake atom. And instead of encoding the adsorbate bound structures, which needs to be optimized, we basically just encode these slab geometries with the active sites labeled in different fake atoms. And so by doing that, you can actually remove the geometry relaxations when you have the adsorbate bound. And also, even these slab geometries can be obtained from the bulk optimized structures from, for example, materials project databases. And then you can completely remove all DFT relaxations associated with the prediction of binding energies. And so we benchmarked our method against a couple of methods in literature, and we obtained the accuracy pretty comparable, or sometimes slightly better, sometimes slightly worse than these existing methods. But the key difference is that our methods does not require the geometry relaxations, either surfaces or adsorbate bound surfaces. And so without that, this could be used as a practical way of representing the catalyst surfaces for binding energy applications. And in fact, we the motivation of us working on this subject was to study this kind of system. This is a jagged platinum nanowires, and this has been synthesized by the Yousung group in UCLA. And they started with the nickel platinum straight binary nanowire, and then they somehow de-alloy the nickel atoms, and then they are left with only platinum atoms. And along the way of de-alloying process, this structure of the nanowire becomes very rough and jagged, ups and downs. And they show that this jagged platinum nanowire exhibited very high specific activities for hydrogen evolution reactions and oxygen reduction reactions. We all know, or some of us know, that even for the same platinum, depending on different surfaces, 110, 100, or 111, because they have different coordination numbers, they have very different activities. And having said that, you can easily imagine that this kind of very much amorphous platinum nanowires would have all sorts of coordination environments. And so in order to understand the experiments, you cannot use a couple of ideal surfaces. And instead, you need to evaluate, you need to be able to evaluate every single active site of this entire ejected platinum nanowires, and then take some kind of ensemble averages. And so to do that, one cannot simply do the geometry optimization for every single site, and that's where we needed this kind of method, which allows us to predict the binding energies without geometry relaxations. And so we did that, and then we did some kind of multi-scale microkinetic modeling, and then from that we obtained current densities as a function of the potential for the hydrogen evolution reactions, and the circles are the simulation results using our method, and this solid lines is an experiment, and they have a pretty good agreement. And the other experimental parameters are also well reproduced. And so by establishing this agreement between theory and experiments, we were able to understand why this ejected platinum nanowire showed such an enhanced activity. Hydrogen evolution reaction usually consists of two steps. First step is the absorption of hydrogen from water onto the platinum surface, and the second hydrogen comes in, and then these two hydrogens are coupled and to produce hydrogen molecules. And the first step is called Balmer, and the second step is called TAFE. And we find that some of these active sites are very good at hydrogen adsorption, and some of sites are very good at hydrogen coupling. And because the diffusion along the platinum surface is very fast, we find that hydrogen is basically gets adsorbed on the Balmer favorable site and diffuses through to TAFE favorable site and get coupled to evolve hydrogen molecules. And so it's basically a bifunctional mechanism, but it differs from the conventional bifunctional mechanism in the sense that in conventional cases, you basically have two different materials, one material doing one good thing and another material doing another thing good. And by combining the two, you get the synergy. But in our case, it's completely just a monometallic material consisting of a simple platinum atoms, but it exhibits bifunctional mechanism due to the morphology. So we call it auto-bifunctional mechanism, and to our knowledge, this is the first observation of such phenomena. And I want to emphasize that this understanding was entirely possible because of the development of this pseudo-atom site labeling method that does not require geometry relaxations. Okay, so I'm gonna switch it and then to a second subject of doing the inverse design. So like I said, once you have this kind of sort of property prediction models, the next important task is to explore the chemical space. And in this review article, we categorized the strategies for inverse design into three different categories: high-throughput virtual screening, global optimization, and generative models. In high-throughput virtual screening, as the name implies, you basically take the database and evaluate the property of each candidate one by one until you find the target material. But of course, if the target material is not in the database, then there's no chance that you'll find the target material. In global optimization, for example, in the evolutionary algorithm, you basically start with some reasonable guess, and then you do some kind of, you evaluate the property of the candidate and do some kind of mutations or crossovers, and you basically balance between exploitation and explorations, and then you try to optimize, you try to find the optimal sort of point. And along the way, you basically utilize the information of the prior visit. And so you can say that global optimization may be more efficient than high-throughput virtual screening. And the third category is the generative model, which I will focus on today. And this is the most data-intensive approach. And in generative model, what we are basically trying to do is to take the database, and you take the entire database, you basically try to learn the distribution of data in the database. And if you learned the distribution of the data, then you basically know where in the latent space you need to sample to get the optimal property. And so by sampling these regions intensively, you basically have a better chance of finding a novel material with the target property. And one of the first sort of works to use variational autoencoders in chemical science is the work by Alan. And in this work, they encoded the molecular structures into the strings format, SMILES strings, and they encode the SMILES information into the latent space, map that into the latent space. So basically, each point in this vector space represents a molecule. And along the training of this autoencoder, you can add a separate property prediction model. And if you, by adding this property prediction model, you can basically restructure the latent space. And so you can see that these red regions and yellow regions, they all correspond to sort of different property regions. And so once you know such sort of a property embedded latent space, then you know where to sample. And you can even do the sort of some kind of optimization by using the gradients of the property. And so in this work that Gian-Marco kindly mentioned, we basically extended this variational autoencoder work to the solid state materials cases. But the first bottleneck was to realize what would be the representation of the proper way of representing the solid state structures. And we used images. And so we represent the unit cells using images, and we construct the variational autoencoders. And this is the two-dimensional projection of the latent space. And because we included the stability prediction model along the training, you can see that this latent space is restructured according to the stability or the formation energies of the material. So this is corresponding to the stable materials, and this is corresponding to the unstable region for the vanadium oxide compound space. And so by sort of sampling in this stable region, we were able to find some novel structures. So on the lower left corner, do you see this formation as a function of vanadium composition, and these blue circles are the structures that are already in the materials project database, and these orange circles are the structures that are newly generated out of our generative model. And you can see that these compositions correspond to completely new compositions. And some of those structures are very close or quite reasonably close to the convexal minimum, suggesting that they might be synthesizable, at least thermodynamically. And we then extended this model and explored the ternary compound space instead of binary. And in this case, we also used GAN, to be precise, WGAN, instead of a variational autoencoder. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the phase diagram of magnesium mangan oxide ternary compound space. And these red circles are the existing materials in the materials project database. On the right-hand side, I'm plotting the same phase diagram, except that I added these red circles are corresponding to the structures generated from our GAN model. And you can clearly see that by using GAN, you can basically fill up the hidden portion of the chemical space between the known structures. So basically by using GAN, you can explore the hidden chemical space, hopefully efficiently. And because we chose this system, because this is some compositions of this compound space are already known to be active as photoanode material, we then examined whether some of these structures might be promising as photoanode applications. And indeed, we find that some of the structures have reasonably good Prouvé stability and band gaps, so that they might be testable experimentally as a promising photoanode application material. Okay, so so in the remaining 5 or 7 minutes or so, let me talk about synthesizability. So like I said, many of these structures or materials that are computationally designed, either using property prediction models or generative models or high-throughput screening, many of them end up being discarded because they are not synthesized. So it'd be good to have a model that can predict the synthesizability. However, such a classification model it differs from the conventional classification, because in conventional classification, you have a positive data and negative data. And by training the model, if you have an unknown data, then by using that as an input, the model will be able to tell you whether the unknown data will be positive or negative. But in the synthesizability prediction task, you only have the positive data and no negative data, because if the material has been synthesized, it's already a positive data. But if it's not synthesized yet, then that doesn't mean that it is unsynthesizable, because it may be synthesized later on. So basically, you only have the positive data and unlabeled data. So for that, we use this kind of iterative, positive, unlabeled learning technique. And I can answer the question if there are questions technically at the end of my talk. So I'll just show the results. So we trained the model with the materials project, where we have about 50,000 positive data with the ICSD tag, and about 80,000 hypothetical data, which are basically obtained by the substitution of the existing materials. And our model has a prediction accuracy, recall accuracy, positivity recall accuracy is about 87%. To validate our model, we basically only used the synthesized data up to year 2015, and then determined whether that model is able to predict the synthesizability of those materials that are synthesized between 2016 and 2020. And we again obtained about 86 to 87% accuracy. And one thing that we found interesting was this figure. It compares the synthesizability score on the x-axis, 1 being highly synthesizable, 0 being highly unsynthesizable, and y-axis is the thermodynamic stability. And we find that synthesizability and thermodynamics is not correlated. I mean, so including us, we usually use formation energies or energy of a pole as a rough estimate of the synthesizability of inorganic crystal structures. But this suggests that that may not be true, and so there might be something more than thermodynamics for predicting the synthesizability. And on the right lower corner, I'm showing the synthesizability of hypothetical materials of the various databases. And MP database, virtual, hypothetical data, about 20% of them are synthesizable according to our model. And OQMD, in the OQMD case, about 10% is synthesizable. And that means that even if there are many hypothetical materials in those databases, we may not really need to explore all of those for our applications when you perform some kind of high-throughput virtual screening, because even if they are selected as promising, they may not be synthesizable. So if our model is reliable enough, that would save a lot of time and cost. To further validate our model, we out of this 80,000 hypothetical data, we ranked them according to the synthesizability score and explored whether any of top 100 hypothetical materials have been synthesized in literature. We find that about 70% of them have been indeed synthesized. And this is the case where they have been synthesized and they have been reported in literature, but they have not been deposited in the database yet. So this sort of shows that the validity of the model is very reasonable, and so this could be taken as another validation. And for experimentalists, it'd be good to have a model that can predict the synthesizability based only on the composition, because often cases you don't know the structure ahead of experimental synthesis. So it'd be good to have a model that can predict the synthesizability only based on the chemical composition, AX, BY, and that kind of thing. And we find we have about 94 to 95% of accuracy, even higher accuracy. And now, since we have the synthesizability prediction models for structure-based and composition-based, we can compare them. And we found an interesting sort of a relationship between the two. So these diagonal parts are the parts where both predictions are mutually consistent. But these off-diagonal parts are parts that where both predictions are mutually inconsistent. In other words, this is the case where structure-based synthesizability model predicts that they may not be synthesizable, but composition-based model predicts them to be synthesizable. So that means that because given composition, there may be different kinds of structures, namely polymorphs. So this sort of 40% of this region strongly indicates that many of the compositions in the materials project may be polymorphs. They have not been found yet, but they may be synthesizable. So we are exploring along the line. And we apply that to this tonal compound space, barium, vanadium, oxygen space. And these stars are the materials that are already synthesized and reported. And we overlaid these results on top of our color-coded synthesizability map. And these blue regions are the highly synthesizable region, and the red regions highly unsynthesizable region. And you can clearly see that all those structures that have been synthesized lie in the synthesizable region, according to our model. And because our model, this positive unlabeled learning, is ensemble-based method, you can even estimate the uncertainty of the predictions. And luckily, all those structures that have been synthesized lie in the sort of a certain region, certain prediction regions. Okay, so let me see. So these are, so far I've been talking about this inorganic sort of materials informatics, but for organic sort of molecular science, instead of a synthesizability, a more proper or relevant question might be synthesis pathway planning. And so we've been working on the prediction of a synthesis pathways for organic molecules. And so, for example, on the right-hand side, you can see that for a USPTO patent data set, there are about 500,000 chemical reactions, and we can derive about 20,000 local reaction templates. By local reaction template, I mean remove all the parts that are same between the reactant and the product, and then you only look at the changes of the reactions between the reactant and product. And this is one kind of reaction template, and you can derive about 20,000 of them by looking at these 500,000 reaction databases. And then you can train the model in short, such that the model predicts the conditional probability of each atom or bonds going through different kinds of reaction template. And so the sort of the dimension of this prediction vector would be 20,000 times number of atoms and number of bonds. And so you will have this ranking system, and then scores give you sort of the reactions with different priority. And we get about 85 to 92 top 5 accuracy. This means that about 90% of the time, the correct reaction pathway will be within the rank 5 predictions. And for example, this is sort of a compound.
Sorry, Yousung, but it would be nice if you could slowly wrap up in such a way that there can be some questions to your talk.
Yeah, so thank you. This is actually in my last slide. So you can apply the same this retrosynthesis model and predict the reaction pathways applying the method. Okay, so I've talked about 3 different aspects: property predictions and then exploring the chemical space and the synthesizer predictions, all using machine learning. And these are the 5 students that worked on all the things that I presented today. And I would like to thank my collaborators, Alan, John, Zach, Bill, Tao, and Xiangping. And thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry for taking longer time. Thank you.
In the audience here.
Yep. Thank you for this beautiful talk. My question was about the experimental verification methods that you have. If you talk about the chemical reaction methods of, for instance, your platinum structure. So is there any way to validate the reactivity as you modeled it versus experiments? For instance, on single crystal surfaces, or is there any way to validate these reactivities?
Right. So eventually, the most important task is the experimental validation. So that's a very good point. And for platinum, jagged platinum case, there is already an experiment that shows that these jagged platinum nanowires exhibits much enhanced activity towards hydrogen evolution reaction and oxygen reduction reactions. And our model confirms that. So that can be seen as a confirmation. And for other binding energy predictions, you are very right that one has to synthesize those alloys and demonstrate those computationally designed alloys would have the properties that are as predicted. And there are cases where these machine learning predicted properties are experimentally validated. But for our case, we have not. So the very first subject that I mentioned, using these mean field descriptors, we identified several alloys that might be more active for CO2 reduction to CO. They have not been synthesized yet, and so there was no experimental confirmation for that part. And so they might be the case where the synthesizability may also be important as well.
Maybe you can take the question by Hongbin Zhang.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for this very nice talk. We have been very much inspired by this crystal representation you kind of designed for inverse design. But a specific question from my side would be about the evaluation of the formation energy or the convex Hall for the oxides. So I think, like from the literature, it is well known that we have to do some corrections to the formation energy convex halls. So then how did you get this done for the vanadium oxide and magnesium oxide?
So that is related to the use of U corrections and the functionals and other technical details. And so I don't remember all the details, and maybe it might be too lengthy to discuss. And so I would like to refer you to the supporting information of our paper. But like you said, these spin states and then the root corrections, they need to be carefully checked and validated against the known experimental data, and also other theoretical calculations in the literature. So we've done that. And we can email exchange if you need further clarifications. I would be very happy to answer the questions.
Thank you. That is appreciated.
Thank you.
We have a question here.
So it's also about the inverse design part. So I guess that the algorithms you used require a lot of data, and concerning the vanadium oxides, I think the actual amount is quite limited. Did you use any technique to augment the number of data points?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, generative model is very data intensive. So you need a lot of data to train in the first place, and we did not augment the data in the first version of the paper. So by augmentation, I don't know what you mean by augmentation, but if you define it to be sort of data that are obtained by the substitution of the materials with other elements, then we did the augmentation. But if you define the augmentation by rotations and translations, and you can generate all sorts of maybe 100 structures for the same unicell, then we did not do that augmentation. Okay. So maybe referring to the first aspect. So there are about 100 vanadium oxide compounds in the materials project database, and 100 of them is far not sufficient. So we augmented those vanadium oxide compounds by substitutions of the existing materials, and eventually we had about 10,000 or 20,000 structures for training. Was that your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, maybe I have a question, but in the meantime, so Elias is, are you ready? Yeah, okay. So maybe I can keep my question. Are you going to be staying for the discussion that we have at the end? I know that it's late for you, but it would be nice if you can.
Yeah, I'll try, but I'm not sure. But if I leave it as a text or message, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so our next talk is by Elias Vlieg from the Radboud University, and so the floor is yours. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman, and thank everybody. I'm very happy to be here. The subject I'll be talking about is not exactly the same as what we've been hearing. I actually will talk about organic molecules in a slightly different database. And I am definitely by no means an expert in this field, but it's our venture into something, and I hope to tell a story that is relevant. So I'll talk about co-crystals, and the persons involved are listed here. So I'm the speaker, but I have to mention that Jan Joris de Vogelaar is actually a PhD student. He really did the work, and he defended his thesis about 2 weeks ago. So he deserves a lot of credit here. I will talk about 3 things: co-crystals, just to explain you what they are and why we use them. I'll talk about link prediction, which is slightly different from artificial neural networks, and then artificial neural networks. But if you have to summarize what we are doing, then you could say it's partner search for molecules. That's the name of the game. Now, what is a co-crystal? Well, it's a type of molecular crystal. We'll talk about organic molecules here, and they can crystallize in many different shapes and forms. And you have many multi-component crystals. So these are molecular crystals which have at least 2 different molecules, and there's a classification which I list here: solvates, salts, and co-crystals is one of them. And it's really defined as a molecular multi-component crystal in which both molecules are solid at room temperature if they're a single compound. So that's very specific. And you think, who cares? But actually, people do care, because in pharmaceutical industry, this is something important, whether you have a solvate or not. So it has to do with regulations. So it is relevant. And so this is the particular class of materials that I will be describing. Now, why do you care about co-crystals? Well, in fact, so typically the a molecule is something that people want to use a drug, an agrochemical with a certain functionality. And if you crystallize as a single compound, it will have certain properties. But if you can find a different crystalline form, you can vary the properties and maybe make them more favorable. And that's the idea. So it's a nice route to change any type of property. And in pharmaceutical industry, bioavailability, how rapidly a medicine becomes available, is an important quantity. And I show here as the example of a drug where you have the solubility as a function of pH as the pure material, and with 3 co-crystal forms. And you see it's very different. And so this is a nice way to tune things. And it's nice because you keep the target molecule unmodified, so it will eventually do the same thing. It's unmodified, and you have lots of options to play with co-crystals. So it's a nice space to explore if you want to change the properties that you're interested in. Now, and that brings to the question of how can you find the most suitable co-crystals and which co-crystals are possible. And normally this is done by experimental screening, trial and error, which is a big effort. And so you'd like to predict this. And this is, of course, an obvious idea. And several methods have already been in use for many years. And typically, what people do is they start with the chemistry. You have syntons, you have particular bonds, hydrogen bonds, van der Waals interactions. And so you can sort of rationalize what goes on. And this is something that, that works up to a point. It's not a, you could say, a holistic approach. You zoom in on particular aspects of co-crystals, and what our aim was to see if we can use a database. Hence, I'm here to see if you can do similar things but in a different way. And so our approach is to use, in fact, a very classic crystal structure database, the Cambridge Structure Database. I think it's one of the oldest around. It has well over 1 million crystal structures deposited, of which about 10,000 co-crystals. And I think it's been around for a long time. It's well organized, well respected. Many people use it. And one thing that's special, you could say, in the context of this meeting, it's not free. You actually have a limited free access, but you have to pay a fee. And so we're going to use this database, and we're not going to say we look at a particular type of chemistry. We're just going to look at the whole thing in one way or the other. And the whole thing is by doing, and this is the two approaches that I'll be describing. One is look at the network of the co-crystals and then subsequently apply machine learning on this. So let's start with the network analysis and what is called link prediction. So the 10,000 two-component co-crystals that are part of the CCDC, you can describe as a network in which every co-former, that's the name of one of the two molecules of a binary co-crystal, is a node. And if there's an edge in between, then the combination is a co-crystal. So it's a nice way of representing all the co-crystals in the system. And there's a lot of network science, right? Networks are important. I mean, social networks, all kinds of networks. So you can actually learn from this environment about how you can treat this and how you can predict co-crystals using this knowledge. And so this is, so you could say, a crash course in network science, and it's also where my knowledge is exhausted immediately. But anyway, you have different network types. One of them is called monopartite, where every node can be connected to every other one. And Facebook is an example, right? Everybody can be friends in principle with everybody else. A different type of network is bipartite, where an example would be an author's article network. I mean, you can't mix them up. And so it's, you have two separate species, but there are many, many links possible. Now, in order to understand what you're doing and predict properties, it's important to know what kind of network you have. You can also have, of course, a mixed type. Now, so the network of co-crystals from the database was analyzed, and it's found that it's in fact predominantly bipartite. So that's something that's relevant to know, because that tells you what kinds of things you can and cannot expect. So it means you have two types of molecules effectively. And so you could type 1, type 2, and you know that type 1s will not combine. That's what you learn from this. So if you do predictions, you know what to look for and what not. And once you have this network, it also allows you to see if there are interesting, scientifically relevant groupings. From a chemical point of view, people say, okay, you have these things with syntons, hydrogen bonding or whatever. But here we can, so we don't look at the structure, we simply look at the network per se. And in the network perspective, you can look at how many co-crystals they share. Because if they have many shared co-formers, then probably they are similar in some fashion. And exactly what similar is, whether it's hydrogen bonding or not, we leave out of there, but we say this is a form of similarity. And so, yeah, it means that you can have similar properties. And this actually allows you to group co-formers and it turns out to be meaningful. So here, well, the thing is a bit slower, I see. Here is, well, actually, this is a subset of co-formers that have many partners. But if you do this grouping, then you'll find that there are sort of sub-clusters, and you see them on the right, where within a cluster you see very few edges. So internally, they don't bond together. So this is another example of this complementarity that I've been describing about different types of behavior. And if you zoom in into these clusters, you actually sort of retrieve the chemistry. So the Synton approach that people have been using, which is a valid approach, but you largely get this back simply by looking at how the network is operating. What you also find is that some co-formers are extremely popular and some are not so popular. It's almost like a social network, right? You have these big influencers and some people are not so popular. This is how things are. Okay, now knowing this actually gives you a tool to predict possible co-formers. In a social network, this is done by looking locally which friends there are. And so here the question could be whether John and Grace could become friends. Well, they have several mutual friends, so probably. So they probably will receive an invitation, whether they like it or not. LinkedIn has got these things, right? Suggesting friends for you and this kind of thing. So that's network science for you. And the same thing is true for co-crystals. So you can locally look at a network and how many co-formers are there in common. Now we just learned that our co-formers are bipartite. So in the example that I show here, naproxen and ibuprofen, well, they're the blue ones, not the pink ones. So actually those will not be linked, but you can ask the question whether this is a likely connection. And of course, the more co-formers they have in common, the more likely this is. So this is put in a formalism, you get a score, and this is how you can do link prediction. You can look at missing links by looking at the local environment. Now this link prediction, well, we did on the entire CSD data, so all the 10,000 co-formers, and well, you get a whole ranking, and so the top 10, of course, should be extremely likely. So that's making our life relatively easy. So these were predicted, and in fact, they were all synthesized. So without not too much effort, you can find 10 new crystals. Now that's as easy as it gets, right? I mean, you take the top 10 of your thousands of predictions, but at least that's a promising start. Next, we use the same thing for an actual drug, praziquantel, drug against some parasitic disease that you don't want to have. And that was already known in the system. It's a well-known drug, and 8 co-crystals were reported in the database. And so you can use the same machinery, and the machinery gives you a list, in this particular case, of 30 interesting possible co-crystals. And by doing experiments, 12 of them were found to be new co-crystals. So that's, I mean, it's not perfect, right? And also maybe we should try harder and everything, but at least it's a relatively straightforward way to find new co-crystals, but also will have new properties. Okay, that was link prediction. So now let's switch to artificial neural networks, the topic of this afternoon, after all. Now, because this is all nice and useful, but this obviously only works if you know something about the crystal, if it's part of a database. Now, suppose you have a new molecule, then what? Well, so link prediction is not going to help you there. And this is where, well, artificial neural networks could help you. And so, because what we learned from this network analysis, that actually there's a lot of information in there. It's a rational source. It's not just a random gathering of molecules. There's information in there. So if you can extract this information, that ought to be helpful in extracting, predicting useful combinations out of that. And so, yeah, this is what we have tried to do to predict co-crystals like that. And so, and we saw a similar discussion already in the previous talks. What you need, of course, is a descriptor that sort of mimics, yeah, the information you're looking for. Now, you don't know exactly what you're looking for, but at least it has to catch this. So this is not something which is trivial. No, and of course we don't have to invent these things ourselves. There's lots of stuffs out there. And so the PhD student tried many different things. But in the end, he selected things that are relatively common. I'm not the expert here, I already admitted. So two things that he tried and found to be successful are circular fingerprints and molecular graphs. GCN is an acronym I've seen coming around a few times more. So this is well known in this field. And this you can do for each molecule, but you can also make a merge form as a representation of the potential coformer that you're interested in. And then, of course, you have to train this. Now, the database is a beautiful case of positive results. You have 10,000 working examples. But if you want to train a artificial neural network, you have to also give negative examples. And experimentally, well, there's no database. I mean, people have locally in the logbooks failed experiments, but there's not an experimental database for that. And well, we've seen examples also this week of where theory, of course, can provide unlikely cases. And in our case, what we did is to use the link prediction that I just described to make a case, a data set of unlikely combinations. You can never be, I mean, so true positives do exist. If you make something, it's there. But you can never guarantee that something is impossible to make, right? Maybe if you try harder and slaughter a few animals on the way, or whatever you do to black magic to make something, you can never be quite sure. But but this is one way of doing it. Actually, I think that if we are going along this direction, it might actually be useful to also have a negative database, right? That you say, I failed. And of course, you cannot be sure, but with some likelihood, put it in there experimentally. Why not? If it's, you can deposit it without being blamed as being a loser or whatever, right? Then it's still useful information. And and for the rest, we use the standard tools that are out there to do the training. So Bayesian optimization, I think, is something that people use all the time. And so a PhD student has learned how to do this. So you have these descriptors and let the system do its magic, train it. And so here's an example how a training session works. So it's the usual cross-validation. You take a significant 90% of the data set, optimize all the different way vectors in there, and you can quickly get good prediction values with that. And the remaining 10% is then used for validation. And well, I think this is standard stuff for people in this field. And what we found by doing this is that these two descriptors that we used actually have very similar performances. There's no, so even though it's a different way of describing the behavior, well, the magic of deep learning somehow finds the same kind of information hidden in the network. And so you could see the graph on the right, precision, accuracy, and loss. Between the red and the blue, it's hardly significant. So what we in the end decided to do is to take a weighted average of both of them to have somewhat more robust way of looking at things. You don't want to have any particular bias. And so, so the accuracy of this training is of the order of actually 97%. So from the data set, it classifies the co-crystals. Well, 19 out of 20 are correct. So that's a nice score. But of course, that's the simple part, because this is the data in the structural database where there's a lot of information. So this is something that you would expect to be reasonably well. This is not what you want to use the system for. You want to use it for new predictions. And so to have a more serious test, we used a molecule carbamazepine, which is part of the data set, but that was removed, all entries were removed. Then the training was redone. So it's like a test case where you know nothing about the molecule and then see what happens. And we chose this because there was a recent, quite careful set of experiments done where lots of co-crystals were reported, so we could have a direct comparison. And here I show, there are lots of examples. In fact, I show here example 26 to 50 of the co-formers that we have used. And so you see lots of molecules here. Green means there's a good agreement. Red, there's disagreement. The number is the numerical value of the likelihood of forming a co-former. There's a check mark. It means that it was found experimentally in the reference that I refer to. If there's a cross, it was not found experimentally. And the crossed zeros are in fact the symbols that were not tested experimentally, but these were the negative data set that we produced ourselves from the link prediction. Now, this is far less beautiful than the 97% I showed you earlier, but this is a more realistic case. And here, the accuracy is about 80%. So it's, 80% is not bad, 8 out of 10. And there's also one case, you see 41. There's it's red because there's a prediction of the value is 1.0 and it was not found. And 42, it looks exactly the same, but it's green. And the reason is that for this particular one, we tried to see if we could find this co-crystal and we found it. So even though the other careful experiments found nothing, if you try again with different methods, there are many different ways to try to produce co-crystals, liquid assisted grinding, and so on. So some of the non-found may be existing there. If you have a prediction of 1.0, you could have an incentive to give it a go. Now, and finally, and this is really what you want to do, this is where we applied it to what is called an active pharmaceutical ingredient, and this is what is called API. I've heard the acronym API several times here, but in the context that I'm talking about, it's an active pharmaceutical ingredient. So different fields have different, or the same acronyms with different meanings. And ketoprofen, it's a painkiller, actually has really nothing in the database in terms of co-formers. And so, well, the whole machine is run. And so here you see prediction, 75 co-formers. They're grouped again here, and you see on the right-hand side the prediction. And so there is a certain class, I won't go into the details here, the green ones and the pink and blue ones that say this kind of co-formers are likely. Now, we did not go through the extent of doing all of them, but there was one example which was particularly interesting, carbamazepine, which is a drug already mentioned earlier. Turns out that this predicts that you can have a dual drug. Now, this is not always what you want, right? Because one could do something, something else could do something else. So there actually are examples out there where you have dual drugs, but this is a nice example. So we went through it and we actually found indeed that this was forming. So it's a bit of a surprise, but yeah, this prediction lets you in the right direction. And we found 2 crystal forms, 2 polymorphs, because what I've been talking about now is simply whether you have the existence of a co-crystal, not whether you have different polymorphs or not. There's no, this is not something we put in the training at all. Now, since then, actually earlier this year, we did some more because you could say a real application. We was a pharmaceutical company said, well, this is interesting, looks promising, but okay, let's see how it really works. So they provided us, and I'm not allowed to talk about this kind of thing, but with proprietary compounds, which they had information, which is of course not part of the crystal structure database in Cambridge. And they said, okay, this is a compound, what would you predict? And we were comparing what they already knew experimentally, but what we've been doing. And what we learned from this real life comparison, but actually rather complex molecules, a bit more complex than the things you find on average in the Cambridge structural database, is that indeed this helps you. It's not perfect, but it helps you. So if you don't know anything, the artificial neural network is definitely a good starting point to have a few tries. But you should not expect everything from this. So if you have a few suggestions, go to the lab. If you find them, if you have real cases that work, you should immediately use this information. You should not say, oh, I don't want to do first principles. I don't want to do anything to do with experiments. No, use this information, both with the artificial neural networks. You can retrain. Even a few examples of highly relevant compounds can change the weighting factors and lead to better predictions. And certainly, as soon as you have one example, the link prediction approach will help you again. So, so you should not be too principled. You just want to get good results. And so combining these things is really something that works quite well. And that brings me to my conclusions. And so this is just an example of things that we have been doing. But what we found is that understanding the structure of the data set, the network, is important to get good results out of that. Negative data is important. And so I'm plugging here for a negative experimental data set could be useful in the long run. And what we found is that co-crystal prediction is indeed is possible using link prediction and artificial neural networks. And you should really try to combine it with new experimental data because it helps you along the way. And of course, it requires a good database, which we have. And in the closing, I have a few more things that I want to say, just for the discussion, because this database is not free. And I think, who cares, right? I mean, if you pay a, fair price, but I think it's still okay. Because nobody's complaining about the CSD. It's not a commercial enterprise. It's reasonable. Industry pays more, users pay less, and it's reasonable. So I don't think, from my perspective, this is a black and white issue. We've been using the CSD for many, many years, deposit crystal structures, checked whether a structure was there. So for us, this work was quite nice. The fact that all of a sudden this, well, you might say boring, I don't know, but just a whole pile of structures, all of a sudden allows you to gain novel insight, something that is useful. You can really predict something that you couldn't do. So it's, and so this is a nice example. Also, you could say a lucky case because this database happened to have the exact right information that you needed, which was very simple, just structure, but this is, it was all there. So this is a nice case. But I also was wondering, so again, for the discussion, is that we used, say, 10,000 data points. Now, our paper doesn't have 10,000 references because we don't do that. And so the people that deposited this in the past don't benefit directly from this. So you should wonder how you should do this, right? What is the incentive for people doing this? And even if you have data descriptors, DOEs and so on, would be 10,000 here. So I don't know how practical this is, something to think about. And so this is an example where we really learned what you can get out of such data. And I think that, as I said here, the data structure was perfect for our application. I think it's very useful to think about what you want to do with the data set, to design all the metadata. There's also discussion here. I don't know how much metadata you really need. You can say, I just put everything in there. Okay, but I think having some applications in mind might help you getting to a more trimmed down version that is maybe more usable than if you just put everything there. But this is open for discussion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Elias. Is there any question in the audience here? Yes.
So on the future of this kind of machine learning of these co-crystals, so what do you see? Do you see that this will go into a direction where you enhance the database by entering other entities such as energy of formation or various others? Or do you think that it goes in the direction where you go against machine learning and that you try to have the molecular understanding of how the bonding works in detail? Could you speculate?
So definitely there's more to be done, right? And so, I mean, this is a tool, and so it will only become better as the database grows. So in that sense, you should keep using this, but you can do more things, right? Because this is only, well, checking whether they could potentially exist. but you can also add things. You could do crystal structure prediction, for instance, to make a more likelihood to be even more refined prediction. You might, but that depends on the metadata. But if the solubilities of the co-crystals would be part of the database, you could also add that, because in the end of the day, a pharmaceutical company is not interested in the co-crystal per se, but its properties. And so you could also add properties, but then you need already more data. And this is typically, well, scarcely available in this particular database. Yeah. But I definitely see a future also for other multi-component crystals, salts, solvates, you can do the same treatment, I think.
Have you actually been doing something with it? I mean, like improving it, or maybe do something which is called active learning, where from the prediction that you had, you made some tests to see.
Yeah. So the examples I showed you are exactly like that. So we made predictions.
Do you have a plan to continue that in some way, to have something which is even better in terms of prediction, or?
Yeah. So the proprietary example that I mentioned is actually where we did this. So of course, we didn't have to do the experiments because they were done by the company, but they sort of, we said, we want to do this experiment, and they could give you immediately the answer. Works, doesn't work. And so based on that, we took the next step. And so this is, I think, how you can do these things. Yeah. But for the rest, yeah, the mechanism is the same. I mean, if the database is twice as large, you just train on twice the database, and it hopefully is better. But also, it's not clear whether the global approach, and because I saw this clustering, right? So we train on everything. Maybe, but this remains to be tested, you should focus on a cluster. You have a molecule which you can say, oh, this is part of this type of behavior. So maybe you should train only on a subset of the database, and maybe have higher scoring rate. This is, we haven't tested that.
Mm-hmm. So maybe, as Tom was pointing, one step could be indeed to analyze the result, to try to see if there is some physics, chemistry to understand that.
So also, when he talked about this, he got lots of people say, come on, you have to do the chemistry. And I think it's true. I mean, chemistry, that's nice, but even if you ignore the chemistry, I mean, Facebook is successful without, actually there's also chemistry using people, but it says, I mean, just connecting people, connecting molecules is successful despite, just looking at the relations is already getting you there. So this is a different approach.
Thank you very much, Elias. So given the time that is passed, we can slowly move to the next talk. So you can stop sharing your screen, and then Assaf can start sharing his. So the next talk show is by Assaf Andersson from Materials Zone.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. And sorry for not being able to come over. So just a second, sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Assaf Andersson, and I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Materials Zone. A bit about myself, I have a PhD in chemistry from Imperial College London, and I was doing research on photovoltaics a lot of years. Big part of my career was actually establishing and running a high throughput combinatorial platform, which I will show a few slides about. And before my undergrads, I worked for, before and during my undergrads, I worked for a couple of Israeli startups, working on networks and databases, and it's like a price comparison engine and security. So Materials Zone was established 5 years ago from the Nano Center at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and it was incorporated a bit more than 3 years ago. Recently, we just concluded round A, and from what I've seen, I guess we are a bit a rare creature on this session. So another thing that I want to mention is that Materials Zone is a material discovery platform. We are in the session of the machine learning, but machine learning is just a part of the story here. So I think, you know, you guys all know the problems with materials data. This is what FAIR-DI is talking about. My story starts maybe, you know, a bit before. And I think, it sort of coincides, with the same arguments. And I think we can all say that, there are problems with materials data and research data. So it's not ready for AI ML. It's not exchangeable, it's not interoperable, so exchangeable between people and interoperable between software. It's not standardized, it's very difficult to collect, it's very expensive to generate and even to reproduce, and there is a serious lack of experts, and this is like, the meaning here is like researchers that knows both material science and data science, and this is the story. We also extend it a little bit to manufacturing, where we involve process engineers also at a later stage of the process. And this is really a critical part of the platform. So Materialson is an AI/ML powered agnostic collaborative platform. On the left side, it covers accelerated research and development. So the idea, of course, is to discover new and improved and economical materials, to improve processes and scale up rapidly to production. On the right side, once we establish a manufacturing line, some companies experience failures and clients complaints, and many times it's related to the materials, and the idea is to go from the R&D to manufacturing and back in the same sort of environment, in the same language. So the platform's agnostic nature enabled to implement and apply, our solutions on multiple verticals and multiple domains. So the way the platform is constructed, we have like a data workflow and a collaboration engine, and we have the insight components, the artificial intelligence and machine learning component. And for manufacturing, we have a track and training alerts and alarm component. And the idea is to have all sources of data connected together, whether it's like the lab instruments or existing databases, existing spreadsheets, data from publications, computational data, data from existing systems like MES and LIMS, lab notebooks, and basically to be able to capture everything that is happening on the lab floor. So the platform is funneling this information from all these sources, standardize it, normalize it, and provide the insights that are needed to get better decisions. So if you look on the flow of research, let me see if I can. So I split it to the three different players: what's covered by the material scientist, what's covered by the data scientist, and what's covered by the process engineer. And this is sort of to highlight, the lack of overlapping in expertise. But if you look on the story of the research all the way to manufacturing, then it's obviously starting from materials, and here we sort of bring materials descriptors. So we create like a repository of many materials, and we constantly enrich these materials with additional information, whether it's experimental or computational information, and we sort of tag everything, so it's having all the metadata in place. The next step is obviously mixing and preparing samples. These samples needs to be tracked. So each sample has in Materialson has a unique ID, unique identifier, unique URL, and you can generate a QR code for it. Once you have the samples, you obviously go through a sequence of measurements, and the idea is really to create something agnostic. So we created a unique parsing engine that basically learns new types of measurements, and we support I think more than 200 files already, and we classify, the physical measurement, and sorry about that. We classify the physical measurement and the manufacturers, the type of instruments, model, and everything, and we can sort of bring measurements from various instruments from various manufacturers into the same data structure, which is really important for the next stage. Then the next stage, we created a unique engine for app development. So we have like all the backend Kubernetes cluster and continuous deployment. This is running on a Bouquet server, and we can very quickly create apps for specific workflows where our users can sort of digest whether it's like protocols of preparation or measurements data, and create sort of tagged data for the next stage. So it's generate observation protocols, and then the observation protocols are going into the machine learning engine. And here we provide the basic tools that can basically be used by any of the players. These are all web interfaces. So with a few clicks of a button, everyone can generate predictions, visualize the data using histograms, overlay spectral data from the same type of physical measurement, and find correlations between any parameter to any parameter. And the last step, which is sometimes, it's the first step for some of our users, is the manufacturing part, where we cover the track and training and alerts and alarms component. This is being facilitated also using multivariable modeling of the data, where we can basically predict failures based on materials data before they occur. So this is one example of the platform. This is sorry about that. So this is an example of the interface. It runs on any device, whether it's a mobile device or a tablet or a PC. You can use the camera to scan QR codes, and it immediately links you to the URL. If you have permission, you can log in into the specific sample or specific material that stands behind this identifier. And then you can quickly view all the data that was collected on this specific sample. You can, if you have edit permissions, then you can also edit it. And the platform constantly generates the provenance that is needed to track. If someone has made any changes, then everyone knows that who is responsible for good and for bad. So I'd like to talk about a few use cases. One use case is actually was a precursor to MaterialZone. So as I said, I was working on this combinatorial high throughput project. This project was funded by the Israeli National Nanotechnology Initiative and FP7. It started in 2011. It was funded until 2015, but continued until 2017, where I started working on MaterialZone at the end of this project. So this is a schema of all the kind of interactions, data interactions, software interactions, instrument interactions, device interactions, materials that happened in this project. So it started with fabrication. These are the black boxes here. So spray pyrolysis, pulse laser deposition, and sputtering. And then it went into a set of high throughput measurements using robots, using scanners. So it did optical measurements where it captured simultaneously total transmission, total reflection, specular reflection, EDS, Raman, XRD, IV curves, and sheet resistance, and many more actually, but it's not covered here. And then the data went into various pipelines of data sort of processing and distillation, and also modeling. So for example, this optical modeling server used to calculate band gaps and tail energy and theoretical absorption. And then you could also calculate nanometric thicknesses of thin films and combine it with data that came from the other instruments. And then basically the idea was that every step, it's still actually operational, every step that you may create several layers of a device, and then you might go into some treatments and start the process again and again and again, and everything is sort of logged and accessible. And then we had the collaboration and the internal work on machine learning and modeling, EFT, and design of experiments, and it sort of went into in a loop and generated a lot of data and a lot of publications. One example that I want to highlight is this story. So we wanted to convince Rust to become a photovoltaic device. Everyone knows that bandgap is almost ideal, also for water splitting, but the charge separation is too bad, and we actually were struggling on all sorts of oxides of iron oxides throughout the first 5 years. So you can see here the Y is a figure of merit. It's not an amazing performance here, but you can see that the first 5 years was really bad. So chronologically, most experiments has failed. There was no really significant trend. And then one day we managed to complete basically the development of the platform and start using the machine learning. And then we did the next sets of experiments. So the blue squares that we see here were 2 months of focused machine learning guided research, where we actually managed to almost triple the conversion efficiency of photons to electrons. So this is what we see here. And the nice thing about it is that once we started to use the machine learning, we got better guidance on improving variance in the data and reducing repeated experiments. And then once we had that, we sort of made several iterations on the genetic algorithm modeling. This is what we used. And we solved the model, and we came with another recommendation for this last set of experiments. So we did this within 2 days, and we got more than almost 5 times better performance than the first 5 years. And this has really convinced us that we should work on something that everyone can use. So today, this data, part of it is loaded into Materials. So here you can see the correlation engine. You can see the photovoltaic performance and a few of the components that you control in the processing. So this is really a process function correlation. And we saw here that the most significant parameter was temperature, and we realized that actually sintering sort of was killing the samples, and this was counterintuitive as a scientist, because typically you will struggle to create pure crystals and you would sinter, and apparently sintering sort of cracked the samples and created shortcuts, and was, you know, a lot of damage. So a few other use cases that are running today on the platform that I can disclose is this AI for QD project. This is a collaboration with an Italian startup called Glass to Power and the Italian Institute of Technology. So the story here is basically a synthesis of quantum dots and salt gel roots, and then checking its application in various functions. So one is creating photovoltaic windows, another one is creating LEDs, and the third one is creating solar cells. So the quantum dots are synthesized in both Glass to Power and IIT, where Glass to Power would take these quantum dots and implement them within a polymeric matrix and create sort of solar concentrators, where the photovoltaic modules are located at the edge of the window on the frame. So they sort of need to find new materials and better particle distribution and reducing you know, poisonous materials. And in IIT, it's really a collaborative project, and both projects are collaborative. But there's like different groups that some of them synthesize the particles, and then the other ones take them to something that is not mentioned here, but optoelectronic characterization, and then to device fabrication and so on. Another recent project that we started is a collaboration with this Bar-Ilan University, Tel Aviv University, University of Maryland, and a couple of startups, and Assaf, a battery maker, which is purchased by Total. And the story here is like a 5 years project on solid state batteries. We're also checking the replacement of lithium with sodium. So this has just started, and we establish here like all the framework for battery research, creating all sorts of apps to talk with potential starts and cyclers, and the basic fundamental materials characterization. Another project that was concluded and hopefully will go live fairly soon, but it's also already in public domain. This is the perovskite database. This is was sort of led by Dr. Jesper Jakobsson and Professor Dr. Eva Unger from Helmut Zentrum Berlin. They used Materialzone to create this infrastructure for data collection and dissemination of information of 44,000 photovoltaic devices. This is actually data that is harvested from the literature. They recruited 80 researchers, 80 volunteers, students, postdocs, some principal investigators from these institutes, where they all collaborated to bring almost 100 attributes for each device. And they created these dashboards that you can see here, and where each point is really a link to the specific publication. It's not live yet, but if you're interested to access it, you can contact Eva or Jesper. And the last use case, I think, or one before the last use case I want to talk, this is another example of some of the part of the interface of Materialzone, and the idea here is that really everything is connected. So as you can see here on the right, this is a sample page, or a material page actually, of a mineral. So each mineral has a chemical formula and physical properties, and sometimes an image, or if there's any other measurement. This was harvested from the internet. It's a work that we did together with Dr. Vinis Venagopal. And we have almost 3,000 minerals in the platform, where only 586 minerals holds the full information, means both the chemical formula and all the properties. So what you could do with this kind of data, and this is sort of demoing the machine learning prediction tool, is run regression analysis. So here you would choose a team, and then you could choose the protocols. We have chemical formula and physical properties. It's not shown here. Then you would pick a target parameter. So molar refractivity in this case is a desired function. So it's going in between 1 and 4, something like that. And then you could choose only the chemical composition. So this is only the elements that makes this crystal, these minerals. So here we see 3, sometimes it's a combination of many. So once this is loaded into the engine, it looks for the part that has both molar refractivity and chemical formula, and it splits the data set automatically into train and test set, and run simultaneously the 3 models, the linear regression, decision tree, and random forest, and it gives you the rank. So once you see the output coming, you could click and use a 45-degree plot, and here you can see how nice the linear regression works with it in this case. So as you can see, the train set help to predict basically the test. So they all fall on the same line here, which means that if you take the remaining 300 minerals, 3000 minerals minus the 586, you could predict the refractive index without any theoretical or experimental attempts. So for us, it's really reassuring and convincing, and this is can be demoed on many other data sets. The idea is that you can very quickly navigate between different data sets, and when you click on each pointer, it takes you to this specific sample or material page. Another thing worth mentioning is that sometimes, and sorry for not showing it here, but protocols includes linked data. So if you use like a formulation, for example, and you mix a polymer with a mineral, for example, you could link to the material properties, and these will participate in the machine learning and correlation analysis, where the machine, like the human, would look for the linked information and bring it as data that will be used for the analysis and for the generation of correlations and regression models. So this is the manufacturing use case. The idea is quite simple, but it works in the same language that the data collection worked. So basically, any protocol that you generate, you can sort of visualize it as a function of time. You can select the specific feature. If you work in manufacturing, you can specify specification limits and control limits, and it will use the basic 3 or 6 sigma approach. And basically, the system will build a model in the memory that it sort of tracks the trends. And if it identifies something strange, it would shoot an email to the users where they know that something is going wrong, and they can act upon it if it needs to stop the production or just fix something as it moves. So this is really useful. Few last slides, if I'm okay with time. So this is the idea of basically data overlap or ontology or whatever you want to name it. But the idea that each lab would have a specific set of physical measurements, for example, that they do. And then based on this metadata, you would find overlaps between labs, and you would be able to suggest data. This is a bit more futuristic at the moment, so it's next step. And here you can see the metadata about the lab and the metadata about the physical measurement. It's a snapshot. And you can see the size of the square, and the color is sort of highlighting overlaps between specific types of measurement or within a specific lab, what kind of measurements they are performing. So this is the materials on team. We are currently 12 and we are growing, we are hiring. We are scattered, so some sits in the Netherlands and some sits in Ukraine, and the rest, actually also one in the US, and the rest are in Israel. And this is it. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks again for the invitation, Gian-Marco, and the FAIR-DI people, and open for questions.
Thank you very much, Assaf. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you. You showed many different things, and I just have a very specific question, because you showed the example where of the perovskites, where there was this massive data was assembled. Now, was this also then used to make a better perovskite solar cell? Or
so this is really premature, and this is something that we actually facilitate for the users. So it's really not online yet. It's still closed for this bunch of people, but I think if you contact them, then you can join this. So this, the first step is concluded, and this is about to go online with a publication in a Nature article of everyone that is involved. So the answer is not that I'm aware of at the moment, but know that Materials on is sort of platform that the users are using sometimes without us knowing exactly what's going on.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions in the chat? Okay, maybe one by me. Okay, so you didn't mention the kind of model of machine learning that you're using. Are you allowed to say a few words about that, or it's really some kind of secret internal to the company?
I think I can say that you know, the machine learning and artificial intelligence tools are, you know, known to everyone, and there is no specific magic, you know, with the algorithms. You know, I guess most of this forum experience, you know, this at some point or another. The important thing is the architecture around everything, and then the, you know, the interaction with the user. Obviously, you know, the being able to, you know, have the data constantly ready to run another iteration on the machine learning. Whenever you add another data point, whenever you enrich another material descriptor, you can always, you know, jump immediately and see, you know, what happened to the model. And this is, I think, the magic in this case. And you know, it's not about really the, I mean, if you consider the architecture around the algorithms, then yes, it's a secret, but but the algorithm itself, it's you know, everything that you know.
Okay. And in terms of the representation of the data, I mean, the featurization. So in my introduction, I was mentioning featurization as an important point. Is it something that you also consider important from the experience that you have, or is it also something that you do in a rather standard way, I would say?
So if you can give, you know, featurization in 2 words, and I apologize for not following.
So I was mentioning, okay, in the case where you go from a structure to a property, that you need to represent the structure in some way. You have to have descriptors. So I said featurization. It's the descriptors that you use for your machine learning part. So I guess that when it's the process, the descriptors that you have are, I don't know, the temperature, the pressure, stuff like that. Do you go beyond these things, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So we distinguish between a material and a sample. So a sample is made of materials, always, you know, predecessor samples, and this is all linked. And if it's a material, then we can constantly enrich the material with descriptors and basically add any kind of representation. So, you know, there we are really not limited by our knowledge. It's like whatever the users want to add on the material descriptor is immediately becoming a parameter that participate in the analysis.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any other question. And so for the sake of our coffee break, which was a bit short yesterday, we're gonna stop here and resume in 29 minutes.
Okay.
See you then. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
So we're back from the coffee break. And so our last speaker of this afternoon session is Anubhav Jain from Berkeley, the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So Anubhav, you can, thank you very much for waking up so early. And so, yeah, the floor is yours for the presentation. You can share your screen.
Okay, great. Is everybody able to see my screen all right?
Yes, we can see you perfectly, and the screen is perfect.
All right, so thank you, everyone. Very happy to be here today virtually and to tell you a little bit about this project that we've been working on called Matbench. In contrast to some of the earlier presentations you saw, this is not really about a specific machine learning algorithm or a specific problem, but rather about how do we actually compare machine learning algorithms? How do we measure progress over time as we invent more and more machine learning algorithms? So it's more of a meta study than a particular study itself. So my name is Anubhav Jain. I'm a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm also deputy director of the Materials Project, which I think was mentioned in previous talks. So in terms of the outline for the talk that I am giving today, in the spirit of some of the overall workshop goals, I wanted to give a quick introduction to the materials project to the people that maybe are unfamiliar with this resource. And I also wanted to talk about a new platform that we have in materials project called MP Contribs. And this is a way for you to submit your own data sets to materials project and have it be visible on the materials project website. So this also relates to all the FAIR principles of making your data findable and accessible, et cetera. Finally, the main topic of this presentation is about how we can benchmark different machine learning algorithms using consistent data sets and using consistent protocols. And so that is the Matbench project that I'll be talking more in detail about. So let me begin with the materials project and just give a quick introduction. You know, I think most people are probably familiar with the materials project, but just in case, let me give a little bit of an overview. So the core of the materials project is really a free database of calculated materials properties and crystal structures. So the URL is materialsproject.org, and currently it has data on about 150,000 different materials. This includes things like electronic structure, photon and thermal properties, and other properties as well, such as magnetic, ferroelectric, dielectric properties, et cetera. As Gian-Marco mentioned earlier in the overview of the session, we don't have every property for every compound, and typically as the properties become more expensive to compute, the fewer compounds we have that on. But we are working continually on trying to fill in the database and have full data on all the compounds. There's actually also a button on Materials Project where you can request that certain properties be calculated. So for example, the elastic tensors. And so if there are certain materials that you are particularly interested in, there's a button that you can click and that will automatically prioritize that compound to be calculated versus some of the other compounds. So most of the materials project is really calculated data. So it's been powered by hundreds of millions of CPU hours in these density functional theory calculations. I say most because, as I'll talk about later in the talk, there's also a contribution section where people have contributed experimental data as well. So in the materials project, the core data set keeps growing with time. So this is not a static resource. We only made this plot up until the year 2018, but over time we've been increasing the number of crystal structures, but actually for a while now, we haven't been increasing the number of compounds so much, but what we have been doing is changing the number of properties or computing more properties per compound. So adding band structures, adding elastic tensors, recently adding more magnetic properties, more piezoelectric properties, dielectric properties, et cetera. So both the number of compounds as well as the number of properties per compound is increasing with time. In addition to just the raw data sets, the materials project also has what we refer to as apps. There are many apps, as you can see on the left portion of the slide. And one of the things that these apps do is it actually helps you make useful comparisons and plots from the data set. So for example, on the top right here, you see a phase diagram or phase stability diagram chart, which really shows you what are the stable phases and what are the phase equilibria for a particular chemical space. You can make these for 4 elements. You can project them to get like an open element. And so there's a lot of useful functionality that you can do without having to write the code yourself. Also, I should point out that, as was brought up before, a lot of these analyses require some kind of post-processing analysis where we are correcting energies, or we're adding reference energies, et cetera. And so by using these online apps, you can kind of avoid some of that process and have it all done for you. So in addition to the data itself, the materials project has many codes that it makes available open source, either with a Berkeley license or an MIT license. Those are both very open licenses. They don't require you to also redistribute derivative packages in a certain way. They're commercial friendly, so companies can use them, et cetera. So there are many packages like Fireworks, PyMatGen, Custodian Atomate, and Crystal Toolkit. One comment that I'll make about this is that Materials Project takes more of a philosophy of having many separate packages versus one overall Materials Project package. And in some ways, this makes it so that you have to install lots of codes and not just one code. But the advantage to this is that there are people that like to use some of these packages, but not others. So to take one example, PyMatGen is the code that, given a crystal structure, will generate input and output files and parse the output files, et cetera. And Fireworks is the code that will actually run calculations on supercomputing centers, regardless of what type of calculation it is. And we haven't merged these two into one package. they're separate packages. And so there's some people that use Fireworks, for example, with ASE, Atomic Simulation Environment, instead of PyMatGen. And there's some people that use PyMatGen but never use all the automatic features of Fireworks. They might use their own automated scripts or things like that to submit to the computer. So we have many separate packages that people can use. So I'll talk just very quickly about two of these. One of them is called Atomate, and this is our calculation workflows. This is what Materials Project uses internally to run all of the calculations that it uses for its data sets. And really what Atomate is the way to generate calculation workflow. So you give it a crystal structure, you might give it a few other parameters like what kinds of functionals you want to use or what kind of settings you want to use for a calculation. And then Atomate will do all the work of transforming this into a workflow. So a specific object that tells you what calculations to do and how to connect the outputs of one to the inputs of the other. And then we'll also take care of running that on the supercomputer, parsing the results into a database and helping you plot the results. So these now, we have workflows now for many different types of workflows. Right now, Atomate is really VASP-centric, I would say, but we've been working with Gian-Marco's group to actually get Atomate released in the future as well. So that way you could do everything fully open source without having to buy any sort of license whatsoever. So yeah, we're working more on Atomate. We're actually working on something called Atomate 2, which is an even user-friendlier way of doing some of these things. But we're happy to answer more questions about that if you have them. More relevant to this session, another package that Materials Project offers is called MapMiner. And MapMiner is really a way to generate feature sets for machine learning. It doesn't do the full machine learning process itself, so it doesn't do the machine learning model. It really is a way to just start with a composition or a crystal structure or a site in a crystal and generate different types of features for that. So right now there are more than 60 featurizer classes. So there's many different types of feature sets that you can do. And each of those feature sets can generate maybe tens or hundreds of features. So you really can generate thousands of potential descriptors using the MapMiner package. The types of features that you would want to generate really depends on what type of data that you have. So for example, in the yellow over here is a composition class, and this just given any chemical formula can generate different types of features, like what are electronegativity differences, like a one-hot encoding of the element fraction, a featurizer related to the Medema model for alloy energies. So there's lots of different types of feature sets that you can get just with the composition. If you have a site in a structure, so for example, in a previous talk in the session, we were talking about adsorbates on a surface. And if you want to know, for example, geometrical properties of the adsorbate, like how many bonds does it have, what angles are the bonds, what sorts of coordinations are the bonds of this adsorbate on this thing, and you want to describe that numerically, you can use some of these site features that will take any site in a crystal structure and tell you things like what's the coordination environment, what's the shape, things like that. There are also overall crystal structure features. So for example, we have the Ewald energy, which will tell you what is the electrostatic energy of a structure that has charges assigned to it, for example. So again, there are many different ingredients of features that you can use, and you can use these features in many different types of downstream machine learning packages, as I'll show a little bit later as well. So the Materials Project is used heavily by the research community. At this point, we now have 180,000 registered users. And so this seems to be increasing exponentially. It obviously can't keep increasing exponentially. So at some point we will see where it kind of levels out. But over the last year, there's been many new users and lots of data being downloaded through the Materials Project from all over the world. Oops. All right. So let me. Yeah, and then finally, I'll just say that a large fraction of the Materials Project users are actually from industry. So about 10% of our users are industry users, about 36% are academia, and almost half of our users are actually students as well. So this seems to be a resource that many different people can use, all the way from the student level to the real industrial level. Okay, so with that, let me end the introduction to Materials Project and tell you about something we've been working on for the past few years called MP Contribs. And this is a way to take your own data sets and disseminate them through the Materials Project. So what we wanted to do was to actually leverage the Materials Project to help build a larger community of materials researchers. So for example, the Materials Project has high visibility in the sense that if you go to Google and you search for molybdenum diselenide, Actually, the first result is from PubChem. The second one is really the original paper, I guess, about the crystal structure. But then the third link is actually the materials project details page for the molybdenum diselenide. So what that means is that when people are searching for various chemical compounds in Google, they actually see materials project results relatively high up, and they're likely to see that data set page that comes up for a particular chemical composition. So obviously there's a lot of data on molybdenum diselenide and all these other compounds that aren't computed by Materials Project, that are either in the literature or things that people are measuring in the lab, et cetera. So we really want to use this platform as a way to help get that data out to the people that are clicking this link in Google. So that's where MP-Contribs comes in. MP-Contribs is a way to allow the research community to contribute their own data sets to Materials Project. The way that it works is that currently on the left is what Materials Project looks like. There's a materials details page and it has all our calculated information about a material. On the right side is MP-Contribs. And MP-Contribs is a platform that looks a lot like other data contribution platforms, where there's different data sets that are contributed by different research groups. And then there's the actual raw data, if you click one of these data sets, as well as some plots and things and visualizations of the data sets. But then what MP-Contribs does also is it takes the data from these data sets and it displays them on the materials project details page on the appropriate material, so that when people are actually searching through all these compounds like aluminum oxide and they're looking for other information, they also are looking through, in a sense, all of these other data sets that have been contributed by the community. And there could be some data in here that is actually linked on the materials project page. So, the way that we envision this going is that, Google links to the materials project. The materials project tells you all the data that we have, but then in one section of the materials project called user contributions, it actually goes to external data that has been contributed by the user community, in this case by DTU. This is Ivano Castelli. Francesco is one of Gian-Marco's old students. So this will actually tell you all the things that not only we compute, but other people have contributed as well. And then you can actually get to the full data sets if you're interested in not just this materials information, but all the other information as well as links to the original papers as well. So let me just end that section by saying that MP-Contribs is open for contributions. So if you have a data set that you think would link well with the materials project that you'd like to disseminate via the materials project, definitely get in touch or go to mpcontribs.org, and then we will help you with that process. One thing that I will say is that MP-Contribs is really designed for smaller data sets, so megabytes to gigabytes. If you have very large output files, charge density files or wave density files, things like that, that's not really the type of data that MP-Contribs is storing. So for that, we would suggest something like Nomad or some of the other repos for more general data deposition that can really handle very, very large data sets. What MP-Contribs is really intended to do is to say that, hey, I have a whole list of band gaps for 100 compounds or something, and I would like those band gaps to show up on Materials Project. That's a very small data set, and that can easily go on Materials Project. The other real thing about Materials Project is that it should really link to the Materials Project compositions in order for it to be useful. So if you had a data set on lots of organic compounds, we don't really have organic compounds on Materials Project. So it's unlikely that someone would get from Materials Project to your data set if you didn't have some links to Materials Project compositions. So with those two caveats, if there's anything that really fits here, we'd really be happy to help you disseminate that. Okay, so let me move on to the final topic of this talk, which is benchmarking machine learning methods using the Matbench protocol. So Materials Project is now involved in an effort to look at different machine learning algorithms and try and understand better how much improvement are we making as we invent more and more modifications to the old algorithms, and also which algorithms seem to work better for which types of problems. And these days there are so many different machine learning algorithms coming out in the literature. Every single one of them obviously reports that they are doing the best on all the different problems that they test for the most part. And so it becomes really, really difficult to decide if you want to use a machine learning model, for example, which one of these should I use? Am I using the right one? Is there some other one that I should be using, et cetera? So we wanted to really help organize some of this information. And one of the things that we see in the literature today is that it can be very difficult to compare performance that it's reported in papers from different machine learning models. So for example, if you have 3 different machine learning models on the top, they're often tested on different data sets. So one of them might be tested on a data set that's formation energies and doesn't involve the crystal structures, only the chemical compositions, and it has 4,000 samples. And then the second model might be tested on a different database that has structures available and has many more samples, and has some data filters applied to make sure that it's only stable compounds and no crazy structures, et cetera. And model 3 might just take everything, and it's very difficult or unspecified what's happening. And then they also report the errors in different ways. So one model might use an RMSE error, one might use a mean absolute error, another one might use some kind of a validation loss. So it's very difficult to know which of these models is really performing better, and how do you do like an apples to apples comparison. So in our opinion, what's needed is something like an ImageNet for material science. I think many of you are probably familiar with what ImageNet is, but really ImageNet is a data set that started now over 10 years ago. And according to this article, it was originally published as a research poster in the corner of a Miami Beach conference center. But ImageNet has become really the biggest and most important image analysis machine learning data set. And there's always competitions now to see how much better we can do in terms of getting a good classification performance on ImageNet. So this is the set of images that were hand labeled to say that, okay, this is an image of a cat, this is an image of a dog, this is an image of a train, et cetera. And then machine learning algorithms would compete to see, could they automatically classify these images as well as a human. And ImageNet was largely credited with really transforming the field of machine vision, because it gave people a unified data set to actually compete on and make improvements on. So if you were to actually plot, so on the left is the plot of over time from the year 2010 to the year 2017, how well did the various machine learning algorithms do on this sort of image analysis problem, again, classifying images into cats or trains or whatever. So in the first year, actually, no algorithm did better than 25% wrong. And there was a lot of scatter between the different algorithms that existed at the time, the different machine learning algorithms. But actually what happened over time is that people got better and better at using this data set and figuring out what are the best ways to actually understand images. And you can see that over time, 2 things happen. First of all, the best models actually get better and better to the point where it's almost as good as a human these days. So the problem is essentially solved. And then you also see that the scatter between the models becomes very, very narrow, which means that every model actually does quite well. And there's nothing that does bad. In fact, the one worst model in the year 2017 is like much better than the best model in 2010. And so what's really nice about these sorts of data sets is that they decouple the data generation from the algorithm development, which means that all these groups submitting to ImageNet didn't have to spend the effort taking 100,000 images and labeling them by hand. They just started with the data set and they could focus on the machine learning algorithm. And in contrast, a lot of times what happens with material science, less so with some of these materials databases, but what happens is that in order to do the machine learning, you first have to collect the data, and that data collection and cleaning process, et cetera, can be the thing that takes up 90% of your time, and then you don't have a lot of time to innovate on the machine learning algorithm. Okay, so what we wanted to do was to have a benchmark like ImageNet for material science, which we called Matbench. And to us, the 3 ingredients were having standardized data sets that everybody always runs the algorithms on the same data sets. Standardized test splits, so even within the same data set to make sure that you're training and testing on the same part of the data. And then finally, an online leaderboard that has what's the best performing algorithm, and also details on how to reproduce the data yourself. So the online leaderboard not only makes sure that the results are reproducible, but also helps kind of incentivize people to try and get on the leaderboard and say, okay, ours is the best for these tasks, et cetera. So currently, Matbench includes 13 different machine learning tasks. And this is different than something like ImageNet or some of the other standardized machine learning test sets, like the GLUE test set or Stanford question and answer data set. And that it's not just one data set and one test. There's actually 13 different tasks. And one of the reasons that we ended up with more than one is because there's a lot of diversity in the types of problems that material scientists face. On one hand, you have problems that are very small in terms of the data that's available. And on the other hand, you have data sets that are very large, and that the types of machine learning algorithms that are appropriate might depend on whether you have a small or a large data set. So in Matbench, for example, we have both small and large data sets. We also want to have different types of materials properties that are computed. And so we end up having many different data sets that we've compiled from the various parts of the literature, as well as from the materials project database. So as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of variety to the problem. So we tried to pick, of the 13, different types of applications. So this includes stability, information energies, electronic properties like band gap and dielectric tensors, mechanical properties like elastic moduli, as well as optical and thermal properties. We span the range of samples, so everywhere down from a few hundred samples to over 100,000 samples, to again see whether certain techniques work better for different sample sizes. There are also different types of inputs. So some machine learning algorithms only work if you have the crystal structure. Other machine learning algorithms don't use the crystal structure information at all and only work with the chemical composition. And so we wanted to have some problems that included the crystal structure information and some that you don't have the crystal structure and you only have the composition. And then finally, we had both regression and classification tasks. The other thing with these data sets is that we try to pre-clean them because a lot of times a difference in reporting is depending on how you clean the data beforehand and what data you get rid of. And so we document all the cleaning procedures for these data sets so that you don't have to invent your own cleaning protocol and then end up with different scores that way. And it also includes both experimental and computed properties. So it's not all just calculated data, it also includes experimental data. So if you're interested in the data sets themselves, we actually used MP-Contribs ourselves to contribute these data sets to Materials Project. So if you go to ml.materialsproject.org, you will see the MP-Contribs site for these data sets, where you can actually see all the raw data as well as be able to download them as JSON or CSV, etc. Okay, so now we have standardized data sets. The next thing we wanted to do was to just standardize the way that we define the training and the test set and have standardized splits. And we did something a little bit different here, so I just want to quickly explain what that is. So the most commonly used test split procedure that you're all aware of is that you have in blue here some kind of a training set that the model has access to for training, and then you have some kind of a holdout set, a test set, which the model cannot use to train, but then is used to evaluate how good the model is. And then typically what would happen is that in the training data, you would internally split that into a training and a validation set. You would use that to help do your model selection and your model hyperparameter optimization. And then when you're finally all done, you run it once on the test set. And then you don't go back and rerun everything because you already used the test set, so it's kind of burned. So that's a typical procedure. What we do is a little bit different, which is we basically repeat this process multiple times, because if you just have one test set, so going back to the previous slide, if you just have one test set, if this test set just happens to be a type of thing that your model does really good at, or has certain weird characteristics, then you could end up with strange algorithms being the ones that perform the best. So ideally, you want to have every data point have some chance to be part of the test set, so that every data point is used for the evaluation. So what we use is something called nested cross-validation. And so the first part of nested cross-validation is just like before, where you have a test set that's holdout, and then you have a training set, and then you again use the training set to update your model, and then you evaluate it on your test set. But then you repeat that process multiple times with different parts of the data being your test set. And so your training data set changes in this next part so that you have to retrain your model using the new training data, and then you test it on the new test data. And you repeat this process, let's say 5 times, so that every single data point has had one opportunity to be part of the test set. you take the 5 different scores in this case, and then you average them together to get one score. So basically, it's a lot like the typical procedure, except now you don't have this thing where, you know, one portion of the test set might be really well optimized for. You have to go through and use every single data point as your test set as well. So there's been some research that show that, you know, this kind of nested cross-validation procedure is, you know, better at getting an estimate of your true error than just having one test set. So that's what we use in Matbench. Okay, so we have standard data sets. We have a standard way to do the test splits with the nested cross-validation. The last part we've been working on is this online leaderboard that helps you get reproducible results. So right now, there's a site that we put up called matbench.materialsproject.org. And this is really an online leaderboard of the different tasks that we've set up and what are the algorithms and how are they been performing on them. So here, again, those 13 tasks that I introduced before with the different sample set sizes going from small to large. And then this algorithm here is of the current machine learning algorithms that we've tested so far with Matbench, which one has been performing the best, and then what is the mean absolute error or the ROC-AUC for classification for that particular model. Here's a plot of the same thing. So the different tasks going from left to right, and then you kind of see these different algorithms and how they're performing. You'll see different characteristics, by the way, which I'll point out again later. But for example, CGCNN is a graph neural network, and you'll see that in the beginning, so these data sets on the left have low data points, and you can see that CrabNet has CGCNN has relatively high errors up here, but then down here where you have very large data sets, these are the 100,000 points or so, it really does much, much better than some of the other algorithms. And so you see these sorts of trends as you go through the data of which algorithms are working better on which problems. So in addition to the raw scores on Matbench and just showing you what's doing the best on each task, there's actually a lot more information that you can get on every single model that's been tested. So for example, you can get sample by sample predictions, which means that for every single data point that was used in the test set, so every single data point, you can see exactly what was the number produced by each model. And that's actually useful because if you want to try to run the models yourself, sometimes you want to know, like, am I using the same hyperparameters, the same version of the code? Am I getting the same results that was previously gotten for these models? And having these sample by sample predictions will help you verify that when you run the model, you're getting the same results as everybody else. Similarly, there's IPython notebooks for every model that shows you how do I actually run the model, like how is the model run in order for me to get these results so that you can run the same code yourself, and the Python codes scripts as well as the IPython ones. And so also for every single model, we have a lot of metadata. So some description of the model, as well as, like, you know, what were the parameters used, et cetera, to run this model. So it really helps not only tell you what the best, you know, models are, but also helps you run them and make sure that you're running them in the same way as other people. Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, you can compare the algorithms overall, or you can look within each task. So this is, I think, the dielectric function prediction task. And you can see, okay, these are the different algorithms on the x-axis. And you can see, you know, which ones are doing better, which ones are doing worse. In this case, you know, AutoMapMiner Express seems to be doing well along with CrabNet. The dummy model is just a very simple model where you take the average of the data set and see how well that does. And so, yeah, you can kind of dig into each of these and get more and more information about the different algorithms. Okay, so far, what have we done with Matbench? We've looked at a few different models, and we are hoping to get more and more of these machine learning models evaluated with Matbench over time. The first one is a very traditional model, which is basically using a code called MagPi to generate the features. These are very conventional features, like what's the average electronegativity and standard deviation of electronegativity of the elements in your compound. And then just using a random forest model to take those descriptors and either make a prediction, like a regression or a classification prediction. Then in addition to that very traditional model, we also have an AutoML model called AutoMapMiner. And this is a lot like the traditional model, but just kind of amped up a little bit. So in addition to the MagPi features, AutoMapMiner uses pretty much the entire library of descriptors that's available in the MapMiner package. So I mentioned there's like thousands of descriptors that you can generate. So it actually does generate many, many, many descriptors automatically for a given problem, given the data set. And then it has automatic routines to try and clean up the features and reduce the number of features down so that you don't have correlated features and things. And then, so once you have a list of reduced features, it uses AutoML to actually try and figure out what is the best machine learning model for that particular problem. So AutoML has a list of potential models that it can try. So it might try, kernel ridge regression, it might try random forest, et cetera. It'll try different hyperparameters for all the different models. And it uses genetic algorithms to kind of search through the space of different machine learning models and try to pick the best one. So AutoMapMiner is also available open source along with the MapMiner package. So this is something that, given the data set, will automatically train and give you a model. In addition to these more traditional paradigms, there's been a lot of work in the last couple of years about deep neural networks and also showing very, very good performance compared to the traditional things. So there is one called CrabNet that works just based on a composition and will actually figure out, what are good interactions between elements and things. So for example, if you have aluminum oxide, what's the interaction between aluminum and oxygen that helps you get to a particular property? So there's one called CrabNet. There's one from Gian-Marco's group actually called ModNet, which is actually very similar in spirit to AutoMapMiner, but instead of using these more traditional ways of doing things, it actually uses neural networks to do some of the feature selection, as well as some of the prediction as well. And then there's also crystal graph neural networks, which many of you are probably familiar with, the original ones, as well as modifications like MegNet. So these are all the types of algorithms that we've been investigating. Some of these are already in Matbench. So for example, there's random forest as well as the AutoMapMiner is already in Matbench. CrabNet was recently added to Matbench. ModNet has a pull request in review. So they've done the work needed to put it into Matbench, and we're just going over some minor things, and that should be there very soon, and you should see it on the leaderboard. And then finally, crystal graph neural networks, CGCNN is already in Matbench. MegNet, we did a previous test for, but then some of the data got corrupted or something. So now we're just trying to clean that up and get that also in Matbench as well. So, so far what we're seeing, I kind of hinted at this earlier, is that some of the graph neural networks work very well for large data sets, whereas some of the more conventional methods seem to work better for smaller data sets. And so what we're seeing here is the data set size on the x-axis. And then this is a normalized error on the y-axis. It's a way of normalizing the error so that the different problems, which have different units and all that stuff, can all be on a consistent scale. And so what we see here is that on the data sets that have, let's say, 600 data points, in the blue is the AutoMapMiner, which is a more conventional machine learning approach, seems to be doing the lowest error. And things like CGCNN and MegNet, which are more the deep learning models, they don't have enough data to really train well. And so they end up with a much larger error. But as you actually get to a larger data set size, what you see is that the slope of some of these crystal graph neural networks like MegNet or CGCNN, they have a very sharp slope, which means that they rapidly get better with increased data. Whereas some of the more traditional models like random forest or AutoMapMiner in orange or blue, they have a more shallow slope so that they don't really get as better as you add more data points as some of the deep learning methods. So what happens is that, around 10,000 data points or so, you have this like crossover between, it's better to use maybe traditional on the left side, but it's better to use deep learning on the right side. And certainly by the time you get to like 100,000 data points, 10,000 or 100,000 data points, that's when you really see the advantage of the deep learning methods. Now, I will say that new methods are coming out all the time, and we might see methods that really do well across the spectrum. For example, the ModNet platform that I introduced earlier, that also seems to do that one seems to do good across the entire range. And so as we see more and more of these models come out, we're going to see progress on this sort of slope. So if you want to use Matbench and you have a machine learning algorithm and you want it to show up on the leaderboard, you want it to show up on these plots and everything, what do you have to do? It's actually probably not as difficult as you think it is. You can really run everything in about 10 lines of code. So you have to install the Matbench Python package, which you can do in one line. And then here's the code that you need to run in order to have all the things that you need in order to submit your model results to us. So you import the Matbenchmark package, and then you basically initialize it. And the auto load is false because if you turn it to true, it will actually load all the data sets at once, and it's going to just take a long time to load all the data sets. So this will just initialize it without loading the data sets. Then this will iterate through every single one of those 13 data sets that I mentioned and load that particular data set up. And then each of these folds is one of the nested cross-validation tests. And then what you do is you actually get the training and the validation. You get the training data basically for every single data set. And then what you have to do is you have to implement the method that will actually, given the training data, initialize your model, all the hyperparameters and all that stuff, which you probably already have if you have a machine learning model. Then you get the test data, and then your model has to be able to make specific predictions for the test data. Again, you probably already have that. And then what you basically do is to just record what the list of predictions is for that fold. So as long as you have a model that can, given a training data set, can initialize the model, and giving a testing data set can make a list of predictions, this task.record will automatically generate all the reports that's needed for Matbench to do everything. So once you've recorded the results of all of your predictions, you can just export that to a file. And that file is what's needed in order for us to put it into the Matbench protocol. So then you just submit that file along with your model metadata to a GitHub pull request, and then we'll review the pull request, make sure it looks all in order. And then once that's done, we can put it on the Matbench website. Okay, so those are the 3 ingredients that we've been working on for the Matbench benchmark. So in terms of overall and upcoming goals, so we've introduced methods that will allow researchers to evaluate machine learning models on a standard benchmark. So we're not all evaluating things on different benchmarks. We also provide metadata and code examples that allow others to reproduce those models and use those models maybe a bit more easily because there are code examples of how to do it. There's specific results that you should get when you make predictions on certain data sets, and then you can verify that you're getting the same results. Matbench can also be a place where you discover new machine learning models. So you can look through and say, okay, for the type of application that I have, or for the type of data set size that I have, these seem to be the best models today that I have that are available in the community, and those are the ones that I want to try. And in the future, we do want to expand the type of tasks. So if you have suggestions for types of tasks that are missing in Matbench, we'd be open to adding more tasks, performing more meta-analyses on what types of algorithms work better for certain problems. And we'd also really like to just plot progress on these tasks over time. So just like you saw in ImageNet, where in the year 2000 and 2010, the performance wasn't that good and it was very scattered. And then over the course of 10 years or so, things got very, very good, and you saw the narrowing of the performance of different algorithms. We'd like to kind of see, does that also play out in the material science space? How much better do we get than 5 years ago, et cetera? So just to conclude, if you're unfamiliar with the Materials Project, it's a free resource that provides data and tools to help you perform R&D of new materials. If you are interested in contributing your own data to Materials Project and making more of a unified community, we encourage you to look at the MP Contribs platform. And then finally, if you are developing machine learning models or you're interested in testing different machine learning models, we encourage you to give Matbench a try. And we look forward to seeing your algorithm on the leaderboard as well. So with that, let me stop and thank all the people that did all the work and contributed to this. So Alex Dunn is a grad student in my group who really set up all of Matbench and did a lot of work for the MapMiner package. Patrick Huck is really the one in charge of MP Contribs. So if you do end up getting in touch about MP Contribs, you will definitely get to know Patrick very well. And then Christy Pearson is the director of Materials Project. If you're interested in any of the slides, they're already uploaded to our group website, where you can click the slides button and it'll have all the slides. So with that, let me stop and take any questions that might have come up.
Thank you very much, Anubhav. I'm looking at the audience to see. Yeah, we have questions in the audience.
Very impressive developments. I was wondering, you mentioned steels, and if I think of steels, then you can think in terms of compositions of alloys or compounds. But if you also mentioned that you can evaluate the hardness and the elastic constants of steels. But the elastic constants of steels are typically also very much determined by microscopic properties at grain boundaries, precipitates, and all these things that people took hundreds of years to develop. Is that in any way included in this, or are you only looking at alloys and compounds?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, the steels have many descriptors apart from the composition or crystal structure, et cetera, that completely change the mechanical properties of them. So the particular steels data set in here was from Citrine Informatics, where they had a bunch of steel compositions. And I think that, I don't remember all the details of that particular data set. I do know that it doesn't have anything like the microstructure size or anything like that. I just want to see if I can bring that up really quickly and see exactly what's in there. Give me 1 second. Yeah, I think that data set just has yield strengths as a function of composition. And anything about like microstructure or grain boundaries or initial dislocations or something that affect the yield strength are not in there. So, you know, with machine learning, there's sometimes the case, right, that the input data doesn't have all the information that you need to actually really predict the output data. And I think the steels data set is one of those cases where it's really just the compositions that were measured along with the yield strengths and doesn't have the actual microstructure information included in the data set.
If I may, a similar question relates to interfaces, because also for interfaces, it depends very much on the interface is usually even the device. So is that in any way to be included in evaluating properties?
Yeah, so right now it is just you know, bulk compounds and properties. So there aren't any interfaces in the current Matbench test set. I actually am not familiar with a good interface data set that we could use and incorporate as part of the Matbench test routine. You know, the machine learning methods typically work on bulk structures and aren't tested on interfaces, and I'm not sure what might be a good data set to use there. So if you had actually any suggestions on what might be a good interface data set to use, that definitely would be an important contribution to Matbench, but I just am unfamiliar with what would be a good data set there.
Yeah, so I'm going to give the word to Luca, but just one short comment on that. I mean, at one stage also there is descriptors that need to be defined for interfaces or for whatever other data sets. So there's also a lot of work to be done there. So, but I was going to bring the problem of the descriptors in our discussion afterwards. So I give the word to Luca.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can.
Okay. So hi, Anubhav. I have a bit of a technical question on this nested procedure in Matbench. So it is certainly good for benchmarking the algorithm, but I wonder which model one is actually benchmarking, because at every iteration, new test set, you will have a new model and then you average all different models. So the question is towards, okay, I done a benchmark and now I want to use a model to predict something for a new material. Which one I should use? Or even worse, how do you know that one is not hyper optimizing on each test set? Because you know the data. This is the case every time you know everything about the data because they are completely public, and then you say, okay, my algorithm is performing very good on the test set, but you knew the test set, so you are free to hyper optimize on that.
Sure. Okay, so let me take the first problem of, you know, now there's 5 different test sets and 5 different training sets. How do you know which one to use, et cetera? So there's 2 things. There's, for the purposes of scoring the algorithm and getting an estimate of how good the algorithm is, and then there's finding the final algorithm that you use to make predictions for your application domain. So the purpose of scoring the algorithm, you have 5 different scores, one for each of the different, you know, nested cross validations, and then you take an average and a standard deviation. So the average score is what's reported on the website of the 5 scores, and then the standard deviation you can use as like a bit of an error bar. So that's that part of it, which is just scoring the algorithms. And then it's like, of the 5 models that you've trained, which one do you use on the final application? Actually, none of the 5. You would want to retrain your model on the entire data set, including the test set, and then you actually use that for going forward with your actual predictions. So that would solve the problem of just having one model for doing predictions. You just retrain it on the entire data set. In terms of hyper optimizing on the particular Matbench data set, it could potentially be a problem in the sense that you could imagine writing an algorithm that just memorizes the entire Matbench data set, and given the input, just repeats what the output is, right? Because you have access to the test set. We didn't hold out any of the test set ourselves through an API or something that you can't access. So that is a possibility. What I would say is that in practice with some of these other test sets, other machine learning benchmarks, it hasn't been so much of a problem. There have been some papers actually that report that on some of these other machine learning benchmarks, that over time, some of the algorithms might be somewhat tuned to these particular things in the test set. And if you start to modify the test set a little bit, the rankings of these things, well, the rankings actually stay pretty consistent, but the actual numbers will actually change. So, in theory, because the machine learning model is only being trained on the training parts of each of these sets, and it's only being tested on the testing part of these sets, it shouldn't really be too much of a problem of this sort of a data leakage. But again, if you want it to be, if you really wanted to hack it, you could actually just memorize the entire Matbench data set, write an algorithm that spits it back out at you, and then you get a perfect score. And so again, in practice, I think it's been less of a concern over the last 10 years or so, as we see on these other benchmarks, but it is something that can definitely creep in, especially as this thing gets older and older and people hyper optimize more and more. So I think it's just something that we have to be careful about, and maybe every couple of years, introduce a new test set or something and just re-rank these things to make sure that things are staying consistent with similar but different test sets.
Yeah, or as some kind of blind competition in which the final test set is held secret, like this.
Yeah, exactly. But
every now and then, because you can do only once for one test set, right? The moment it is known, then you can do it every time. And then.
Exactly, yeah. But even the blind test sets, you have to limit the number of times people can run the algorithm on the blind test set, right? Because otherwise people still find ways to hack the test set, where if you're allowed to evaluate your
that would be
score,
one shot.
Yeah,
yeah. On Kaggle is one shot. You are allowed to submit once and you get your score. When you're sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so they have like 2 blind test sets often, right? Where one you can kind of access a few times, and then one that's like, okay, this is your final score, and you don't get access to it. So you can also set up something like,
public, private, and so on.
Yeah. So these are all good suggestions. I think we're still in the beginning stages of some of this, but as we move forward, and if we're seeing evidence of this sort of hacking, then I think we'll have to move to more strict protocols to make sure that people aren't actually designing the models specifically to the test set, but are actually solving the actual problem itself.
Yeah, we have one question here.
I have a question about Matbench part. I think for most machine learning package, there are validation inside the model. And I'm wondering if there is a validation for the random forest. And if there is, what's the scoring method for it?
Yeah, so to be honest, I'm not sure that I understood the question. So do you mean in terms of training the hyperparameters? Like what is the validation set used for training the hyperparameters of these models? Or for, is that what you're meaning? Like the internal hyperparameter training, what's the score that's used for that?
Yeah, I mean for the random forest, there are hyperparameters. Sometimes we can use grid search for the hyperparameters. And through the article, I didn't see you talk about the grid search of the hyperparameters for the random forest.
Yeah, so the Matbench package itself just gives you a training set, and then you are free to do whatever you want to optimize your model with that training set. So you could split it up into a training and a validation set, and then use the training set to pick your model, and then use the validation set to update the hyperparameters, et cetera. So if you want to, you can follow that procedure where you use grid search, et cetera, to do it. And that's,
I think she was referring to Automat Miner, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, I see. Okay. So how does Automat Miner do the actual search? So Automat Miner takes your training set, it splits it into an internal training and validation set. And then it uses that, uses a library called Teapot to actually do a search of the hyperparameters as well as the model itself. And then Teapot is the AutoML package that actually searches through everything using your training set. So it uses genetic algorithms. So rather than using a grid search, which is very expensive, and then you have to try every single combination, it uses genetic algorithms to try and do it a little bit more efficiently and try to get to an optimum with less time. So with AutoMapMiner, there's actually a setting that says, how long do I spend trying to optimize hyperparameters? And so you can spend just a little bit of time, in which case I'll do a little bit of a genetic algorithm, try different hyperparameter combinations, and then give you the best result that it has. Or you can say spend 12 hours trying to look at hyperparameters, and then it will run this optimization process a bit longer and give you potentially a better model. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, we have one question there. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Anubhav, for the talk. It's just a follow up on Luca's comment. Maybe it's, I was also thinking about the fact that indeed the idea about what is the final model when you do this benchmarking is like an important point, because I agree it's sometimes confusing with this nested k-fold. And so maybe I was just thinking that maybe adding like the final model to Matbench could be a nice thing to maybe see in the future or anything to make it available somehow, but trained on the whole data then, and not just on the separate folds.
Yeah. So currently the Matbench was intended mainly to be more of just like, here's a ranking of the different algorithms, and if you want to know how to do the entire thing, if you want the model itself, go to like the model webpage and get the thing. And then the Matbench itself shows you the training on the different folds, like it shows you the code for training on the different folds, and then also so then you have to I guess you have to rerun that code on the entire data set and then get your model out, right? So it wasn't a repository of the actual models themselves. Now there's someone named Logan Ward at University of Chicago that was working on actually having a repository of machine learning models. And I'm blanking on what the name of this resource was, but it was intended to be a repository of the model files themselves with all the hyperparameters all serialized and everything, so that you could just load it and use it right away. So what I think we would want to do is to try and maybe work with them because they already have set up a repository of different machine learning models. Let me see if I can find it really quickly and put it in the chat. A DL Hub, yeah, someone put it in the chat already. DL Hub is the name of what they've been working on. So maybe what we can do is in Matbench, just put a link to DL Hub where you can download the final model files and then just be able to use it out of the box. Sorry, Luca, if that was also what you were referring to, I just didn't understand, but I think maybe this clarifies a bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions here in the audience. I don't see any in the online. So maybe we can move. Yeah, first, let's thank Anubhav again for the very nice talk and the answers. So we have now 2 speakers left, I think. So we have Assaf, at least last time that I was checked, he was there, but I don't see him anymore. So there's only you left, Anubhav, among the speakers. So for the discussion here, I wanted to maybe bring two things. One was actually is coming from the discussion that we had with our experimental colleagues. So they would be happy to see some success stories about using machine learning to predict something, or and so far most of the examples that we have seen are essentially to speed up the DFT calculation, and in a sense Matbench mainly also goes in that direction, though. I mean, you showed that there are some of the databases were experimental ones, but usually the experimental ones are smaller, so those are those in which we make the biggest error. So I don't know if among the people still here you have an example that we can show to our experimental colleagues where really using machine learning was a breakthrough or something really very helpful to to give success to one of the projects. So apart from speeding DFT, that's essentially the main application that you all see for I mean, I think that, you know, the example that Yousung was showing, where we can go in the direction of these generative adversarial network, for instance, could be a way to get success. I mean, we have seen from is that, first of all, it's not very easy. And from the example that he gave, he only had something like the stability, and it was not a full success. So maybe the amount of data that we have is not yet sufficient to go to something like that. So.
I may come back to you on this in a year or so. So we just finished a screening project where we were looking for new channel materials for oxides in transistor channels, and we're currently trying to create these materials, create actually transistors out of them, and test whether this happens. And these materials are actually being predicted after DFT calculations, training machine learning, and then developing new candidates. But now we have to do the actual experiment, and that is tough work.
No other examples? Okay, so then maybe I can bring my second point, which was about the representation. So we have seen that, I mean, the way in which you present the structure, and also in the case of Matbench, this is something that you didn't highlight, Anubhav. So you showed that the different methods have, you know, you presented them in terms of the classical random forest and so on. Then the neural networks with the convolutional graph networks. But there's also the way in which you represent the data that is important, and especially, I mean, when I think about, again, this these generative networks, what we want in the end is that to predict a structure or a composition. And so what is the best way to represent that? Did we already achieve some kind of agreement about that? So yesterday we were discussing about SOAP and then ACE, sorry. Is there other ways to represent things that are found to be more appropriate than others? Yes, Anubhav.
So regarding the topic of descriptors and representation, you know, what seems to me to be happening is that as you have more data points, the less important it is that you upfront come up with a good descriptor, because the layers of the neural network will learn your descriptors for you. And so, you know, I'm not sure that we've come up with the best descriptor, but as the data sets get longer or get larger, it might become less and less important for us to come up with the best descriptors.
It depends for what, Anubhav, because precisely, I mean, with you know, with Automat Miner, we have a huge amount of features, and so you're perfectly right with respect to that. But now let's say that you want to optimize. There was the, you know, in the talk of Yousung, he was presenting this global optimization or the generative adversarial network, where what you want to do is to achieve one specific property. What is the structure that you need to create? And since, I mean, what we would do in the case when we use the Automat Miner, we would be able to say, oh, if a material had these features, then it would have this property. But we aren't able to say which material has this feature. So this is why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, I mean, for that, you know, this is still a tough problem. I've seen people have a second model, right, that takes the descriptors and tries to turn them back into a crystal structure, right? So you end up with two models that end up needing to be used. But yeah, it's still an open problem as far as I know, right?
Someone else wants to comment on that?
Well, so in my case, I just only use the composition as a descriptor because I want to search for a certain composition.
But so how did you represent the composition?
Oh, my composition is just a weighted average of the weighted composition vector. That's
so you have a vector
else.
With the
I just have like 12 elements, and my first number is the amount of element 1, and the second vector of the second entry is the amount of element 2. That's just.
But then you have to do this, what was called a global optimization in that case. So that means that you have to search that, I don't know how many elements you consider.
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't talk about this, but it could have been in this session as well, right? So basically I have a 12-dimensional element space. So we did a pre-selection on the elements, and I calculated the properties, 5 properties effectively that I'm interested in. for all the primary and binary oxides. So I take 1 element oxides and 2 element oxides. So three elements, right? So 2 elements and oxygen. And that basically I developed until a database of 4,000 materials, amorphous materials, which I then use to generate models that predict properties of arbitrary complexity. And then I use minimize an objective function that tries to kind of improve, or let's say define the optimal candidate for all my properties at the same time, because I don't just want to tune the band gap or something. I need to kind of have 5 properties in the right range at the same time.
Yeah. Other experience, maybe? Or the questions that people want to bring about these machine learning models?
So yeah, I think in the case of inverse design, the feature choice will be much more important than in the direct problem, where it's of course much less important, because if you have more data, then it doesn't really matter. But in the reverse, when you do generative modeling, I think that case is very tricky, and I don't know. I mean, I think it's still somehow an open question to see how we could.
Yeah, I mean, in the video that I was showing where, you know, with the faces, you know, if we were able to find this latent space in which we can say, okay, I'd like this material to be more conducting or more transparent or whatever, then it would be I mean, super cool, I think. But indeed, it's still a very open and difficult problem.
You have seen some examples in the first talk, but they were quite.
But it was
limited.
about stability mainly, and so we could see really two things, and so.
I mean, limited in composition.
But you know, when you have the faces, people, I mean, I showed the example of the women men thing, but they have something about also different kind of thing. They can make the people younger, older. They can make their change the color of the eyes, the color of their hairs. So they found in this space of the faces, they found very many direction. And so it would be interesting to have something like that for materials as well.
And also the big limitation, I think, in my opinion, will be the amount of data we have with respect to what they have for faces in our material space, which is more limited.
Yeah.
Well, I've also seen that some properties are much easier than other properties. Stability, in my case, oxides, almost, I mean, with very easy to model that correctly. Other properties, things that effectively measure electronical conductivity of an amorphous material is way harder to model properly, and you have much more noise, and even gaps is also already way more tricky to model properly. So it's a tough problem, and per observable, it's differently complex.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other point that people would like to bring in this discussion about the machine learning, where we should go? So, I mean, there's there's a proposal by Luca for a second workshop. Anubhav. Yeah, I'm just gonna finish my sentence and then I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, why don't you finish it and I'll go after you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, Luca is proposing a second workshop in order to find similarity between structure, and this also in a sense goes in the direction of the representation of the structures, because to find some similarity you need to find some representation of the structure and then measure the distance in a sense. Yes, Anubhav, please.
So yeah, just in terms of other topics, one specific problem that we ran into recently in our group is we were just interested in investigating these these GANs for materials prediction, and there have been many people that have been publishing crystal structure GANs for doing various things, and many journal articles have been published. But what we wanted to do was to actually say, okay, let's just try running some of these other methods first before we try and invent our own and just see how these things are doing. And what we found is, I don't remember the exact statistics, but let's say there were 5 things published, code was actually available for 2 or 3 of them. The rest of them would say code available on request. And then, you contact them and they say that the code's not ready. And so, of the 5, we can actually get code for 2 or 3 of them. And then of the 2 or 3 that have the code, only 1 of them is actually installable. And the other 2 or 3 just are broken. And so of the 5 things that are available in the literature, you can actually just try 1 of them. And the other ones are just inaccessible. And so you're kind of forced to it. So I just wanted to put out, is there something that we can do as the leaders of the community or something to try and improve on these statistics and try to make it so that, we can at least try and run 70%, 2/3 of the things that have been published out there and be able to try it. So yeah, if any suggestions would be welcome on that front.
Yeah, I mean, this morning there was Giovanni pointing to the fair aspect of the workflow. So sharing the workflow. I mean, what you're suggesting here is sharing the algorithm to do this GANs. I think it's important indeed.
Yeah, and we talked about the DL Hub earlier, which I think could help with some of this stuff. Which if it's on DL Hub, you at least have some file that you can be runnable. But I think it's better in the computer science community in the sense that when people publish things, you can actually run them, and it's more of a requirement. It's not like you can just be like, "Hey, code available on request," and still be able to publish. So I don't know if people are for being strong, taking a stronger position on this, or whether it's something that we just kind of leave alone, and hopefully the community will sort itself out by having more tools and things to make it easier for people to do this.
Are we done? Okay, thank you very much to everyone, especially to Anubhav for waking up so early. And so we'll reconvene tomorrow. So as you have seen, the morning session starts a bit later than usual. We're going to be starting at 10:15. And also there is a slight change in the afternoon. Unfortunately, the chair of the afternoon session has some medical issues, and so he cannot participate. And so basically all the talks are, all the session is shifted by 15 minutes, the introduction being removed. Okay, so see you tomorrow at at 10:15 CET. I cannot give that in all the different times in the world. Okay, thank you all very much and see you tomorrow. Bye.